Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story, I'd really appreciate it if you could use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review also helps out so much. And if you want, comment what time it is for you and where in the world you're listening from. We love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And of course, if you're enjoying the content, please consider subscribing. Now, let's get into tonight's story. The discovery began with something so small that most people would have dismissed it entirely. Noah Klein sat in his cubicle on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Seattle, staring at a screen filled with error logs that nobody else wanted to review. His job title was Back-End Systems Auditor, which was a polite way of saying he spent 40 hours a week reading through the digital garbage that enterprise software produced when something went slightly wrong, but not wrong enough for anyone to care. He had been doing this work for 6 years. He was good at it because he had the kind of mind that found patterns in chaos, the kind of brain that could spot the single discordant note in an orchestra of data. Most people found his work unbearably tedious. Noah found it calming. Numbers didn't lie. Systems didn't have hidden agendas. Code did exactly what it was told, even when what it was told was stupid. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Noah was contracted to review archived error logs for a global cloud storage provider called Cirrus Systems. The company stored data for hospitals, banks, universities, telecommunications companies, and millions of individual users across 6 continents. Their infrastructure was enormous, redundant, and theoretically fail-safe, which meant, of course, that it failed constantly in small, invisible ways that Noah was paid to catalogue and explain. He had been scrolling through timestamp errors for the better part of an hour when he noticed something unusual. A cluster of identical errors, all occurring within the same 1-second window. That alone wasn't remarkable. Coordinated failures happened, but these errors weren't coordinated. They appeared across systems that had absolutely nothing to do with each other. Financial servers in London, weather satellites feeding data to stations in Tokyo, hospital databases in Mumbai, telecommunications networks in Sao Paulo, all recording the exact same micro-timing drift at the exact same moment. Noah leaned closer to his screen. The timestamp drift was minuscule, measured in milliseconds, but it was identical across all systems, down to the 10th decimal place. These systems did not share clocks. They did not synchronize globally. They operated on entirely different networks, different continents, different security protocols. There was no technical reason they should experience the same timing error at the same instant. Noah opened a new terminal, window, and started pulling data. He expanded his search parameters, querying not just Cirrus Systems, but every client database he had access to through his contract clearances. The search took 11 minutes to compile results. When the data populated, Noah felt something shift in his chest. A small, cold weight settling into place. The anomaly wasn't limited to Cirrus Systems, it was everywhere. Across every major infrastructure network he could access, the same timestamp drift appeared. Power grids, air traffic control systems, stock exchanges, university research databases, government weather services. All of them showed the same error, the same correction, the same silent adjustment occurring within a single second on the same date. October the 3rd, 3:15 and 42 seconds in the afternoon, Pacific time. Noah checked the date. Today was October 17th. This had happened 2 weeks ago, and somehow no one had noticed. Or if they had noticed, no one had said anything. He spent the rest of the day pulling more data, cross-referencing systems, checking and rechecking his methodology. The scope of what he was seeing expanded with each query. Banking systems operated by SWIFT, the worldwide financial messaging network, the European Organisation for Nuclear Research, known as CERN, with their precision timing systems for particle collision experiments, the International Space Station telemetry feeds, the Global Positioning System satellite network maintained by the United States Space Force, India's Regional Navigation Satellite System, China's Beidou constellation, Japan's Quasi-Zenith satellite system, all of them. every single one. The same microsecond-level timestamp drift, appearing like a fingerprint across systems that had no business sharing any commonality whatsoever. By the time the sun set over Puget Sound and the office lights automatically brightened to compensate, NOAA had confirmed the pattern across 47 independent systems in 19 countries. The error code, when it appeared at all, was always the same. R Sync Anomaly Autocorrect. Not a standard error designation. Not something that appeared in any official documentation he could find. Identical timestamp drift. Identical correction. All occurring in the same impossible moment. There was no blackout that day. No solar flare. No reported cyber attack. No equipment failure. No official incident report of any kind. He checked news archives, government databases, technical bulletins from every major infrastructure organisation. Nothing. October 3rd had been, by all official accounts, a completely ordinary day. Just a subtle discrepancy in time, and once noticed, it could not be unseen. NOAA stayed late that night, alone in the office except for the cleaning crew that moved quietly through the halls with vacuum cleaners and trash bins. He built a visualization of the data, a timeline that showed the anomaly spreading across the globe in perfect synchronization. It looked like a wave, except waves had a source point. Waves propagated outward. This appeared everywhere at once, as if reality itself had stuttered, and then corrected itself before anyone could notice. He saved his work to an encrypted drive and went home to his apartment in Capitol Hill. He didn't sleep well. His mind kept turning over the problem, examining it from different angles, searching for the rational explanation that would make everything make sense again. The next morning, NOAA arrived at work early and immediately began searching for historical precedents. If this had happened once, it might have happened before. He wrote a script to scan archived logs going back 10 years, searching for similar patterns of synchronized anomalies. The script ran for 3 hours. When it finished, NOAA stared at the results with a growing sense of unease. There were earlier instances, not many, but enough to establish a pattern. 8 events over the past decade, each one showing the same signature of synchronized global corrections. May 17th of the previous year, March 9th 2 years before that, September 22nd 4 years back, November 3rd 6 years ago, February 11th 7 years prior, October 19th 8 years back, June 6th 9 years ago. And the earliest one he could find, January 29th, 10 years ago, almost to the day. Each time, the same signature appeared. Brief global anomalies, mass timing inconsistencies, unexplained synchronization errors that appeared across disconnected systems and then quietly corrected themselves. NOAA started pulling up news archives for each date. He wanted to know what else had happened on those days, whether there were any major events that might explain or coincide with the corrections. May 17th of the previous year, a major cryptocurrency exchange had experienced what they called a temporary desynchronization event that lasted 43 seconds. During that time, transactions were processed, but not recorded properly. The exchange blamed it on server maintenance and compensated affected users. No regulatory investigation was ever opened. But NOAA noticed something else. That was the same day that several major social media platforms reported unusual activity spikes, with millions of users posting and then deleting content within minutes, claiming they didn't remember writing the posts. March 9th 2 years before, nothing major in the news. But when NOAA dug deeper, he found scattered reports of GPS malfunctions affecting commercial aviation across the Pacific Rim. Planes hadn't crashed, but pilots reported their navigation system showing impossible positions for brief moments before correcting. The incidents were attributed to solar activity, despite the fact that there had been no significant solar events recorded that week. September 22nd, 4 years back. This one was more interesting. That was the day of what conspiracy theorists called the Reddit blackout mystery. For approximately 90 seconds, users across multiple continents reported seeing posts and threads that didn't belong in their timeline. Old posts appearing as new, deleted content briefly visible, comments responding to threads that didn't exist yet. The official explanation was a caching error during a database migration, but Noah found something else. September 22nd was also the date that CERN had reported unexpected fluctuations in their atomic clock network. Not a malfunction, they insisted, just an interesting anomaly that occurred during a routine calibration. The fluctuations happened at exactly the same time as the Reddit incident. He kept digging through each date. The patterns emerged like hidden images in static. November the 3rd, 6 years ago, coincided with the infamous Mandela effect surge, where thousands of people simultaneously reported remembering Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, despite him having lived until 2013. That same day, Wikipedia administrators noted an unprecedented number of users claiming that articles had been changed without edit history logs. The claims were dismissed as mass confusion, but the volume was statistically unusual. February 11th, 7 years prior, was the date of a global financial trading anomaly, where stock prices briefly showed values that would have required transactions that never occurred. Trading was halted for 17 minutes across Asian markets. Regulators blamed a software glitch in high-frequency trading algorithms, but no specific bug was ever identified or fixed. October 19th, 8 years back, was harder to trace, but Noah eventually found references to it in obscure technical forums. Database administrators around the world reported that backup verification processes were failing because current data didn't match archived snapshots. Not corruption. The data was valid. It just didn't match records that had been created only days before. The explanations range from backup software bugs to administrator error, but the timing was global and simultaneous. Each time, nothing catastrophic happened. Official explanations, when they existed at all, were vague and technical. Atmospheric interference, quantum fluctuations in atomic clocks, software bugs in timing protocols. The data was quietly corrected and everyone moved on. But Noah noticed something else. The dates weren't random. He created a spreadsheet tracking technological milestones. May 17th of the previous year was 3 months after the activation of the final nodes in the European Union's quantum encrypted financial network. March 9th, 2 years before, occurred 2 weeks after worldwide Internet of Things device connections exceeded 50 billion active units. September the 22nd, 4 years back, came immediately after a major expansion of global satellite networks, adding 3,700 new communications satellites to low Earth orbit. It was as if the anomalies occurred when the system became too complex, when too much data was being processed, when too many connections were being made, when the infrastructure of reality itself was being expanded beyond some invisible threshold, when there were too many observers. Noah sat back in his chair, his hands resting on his keyboard. A thought was forming in his mind, a thought he didn't want to fully articulate even to himself. But it was there, persistent and growing. What if this wasn't a malfunction? What if it was maintenance? He spent the rest of the week digging deeper. He found references to the anomalies in obscure technical forums, buried in threads about timekeeping standards and network synchronization protocols. Most people dismissed them as statistical noise or measurement error. But a few voices stood out. Engineers who seemed to be speaking carefully, choosing their words with unusual precision. One post from a systems architect who worked on infrastructure for transcontinental data cables caught his attention. The post was 3 years old, discussing an unexplained synchronization event that had briefly disrupted financial trading systems across Asia and Europe. The username was Pacific Conduit, and they had a long posting history of thoughtful, measured technical analysis. The architect wrote, "We ran every diagnostic available, triple-checked our methodology, brought in external auditors. The timing error was real, measurable and consistent across all nodes spanning 14,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable. But there was no source, no propagation delay, no evidence of any technical cause. It simply appeared everywhere simultaneously and then corrected itself within milliseconds. The official report attributed it to a calibration error in atomic clock networks, but I've worked with atomic clocks for 20 years. I've seen them fail in every possible way. They don't fail like this. They don't fail in perfect synchronization across geographically distributed systems with independent power sources and no common failure point. Someone on our team started calling it the patch. Not an outage, not a hack, a correction. Like when you update software and it fixes bugs you didn't know existed. Management told us to drop it and move on. We dropped it, but I didn't forget. Noah read the post 5 times. Then he started searching for the term, the patch. The results were scattered but consistent. Network engineers discussing unexplained corrections that happen too fast to be manual interventions. Database administrators noting silent data repairs with no recorded cause, no script execution logs, no administrator access records, no evidence of any process that could have made the changes. Security researchers puzzled by checksum validations that fix themselves, showing corrupted data one moment and perfect integrity the next with no intermediate state. One thread from a Linux kernel development forum caught his attention. A developer had noticed that certain system logs showed timestamp corrections that preceded the events they were supposedly correcting, as if the fix had been applied before the error occurred, or more accurately, as if the error and the fix had occurred simultaneously, but the logging system could only record them sequentially. It's like watching someone edit a document in real time, the developer wrote, except the cursor is moving backwards through text that's already been written. The changes appear, and then the history adjusts to accommodate them. I've seen this 3 times now, always during periods of high system load, always resolves itself, always leaves me feeling like I glimpsed something I wasn't supposed to see. Another thread, this one from a forum for satellite engineers, discussed anomalies in telemetry data during orbital maneuvers. The physics doesn't work backwards, someone had written. You can't have a course correction that precedes the detection of the deviation it's correcting. But that's what the logs show. Correction applied, then deviation detected, then position normalized. The timestamps are sequential. The causality is reversed. We reported it. Got a memo back saying our logging system had a known issue with timestamp sequencing during high-priority operations. Thing is, I helped design that logging system. It doesn't have that issue. Always the same pattern. Something breaks in a way that shouldn't be possible. Then something fixes it in a way that shouldn't be possible, and everyone agrees to pretend it was normal. Noah tried to reach out to the systems architect who had written the original post about the patch, but the account had been deleted, not just inactive, completely removed from the forum's database. He found 2 other engineers who had mentioned similar events in detail, and sent them carefully worded messages asking for more information. Messages that didn't sound alarmist or conspiratorial, just professional curiosity about unusual edge cases in distributed systems. One never replied. The other sent back a single sentence. I don't work in that field anymore. Noah tried following up, asking what field they worked in now. The account was deactivated the next day. On Friday afternoon, Noah took a risk. He attended an infrastructure security conference being held at a hotel near the waterfront. He wasn't registered, but he bought a day pass at the door and spent hours moving between presentation rooms and networking sessions, listening to engineers discuss threat models and backup protocols and disaster recovery plans. During a coffee break, he approached an older man who had been introduced as having worked on satellite systems for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for 30 years. Noah mentioned the timing anomalies casually, framing them as a curiosity he had noticed in some archived data. The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A recognition, a wariness. "You noticed the corrections," the man said quietly. It wasn't a question. The what? That's what we called them, back when I was still active. The corrections. The man glanced around the room, then leaned slightly closer. "You're not the first person to spot the pattern. You won't be the last. But you should know that asking questions about it openly is a good way to make your career complicated." "Why?" Noah asked. "Because there's no good answer, no explanation that makes sense. So the people who control these systems decided the best approach was to not have the conversation at all." The man paused. I spent 2 years trying to understand what caused them. I built models, ran simulations, consulted with physicists. Nothing fit. Eventually I realised I had a choice. I could keep digging and become the crazy guy who sees patterns that aren't there. Or I could accept that some things don't have satisfying explanations and move on with my life. Which did you choose? Noah asked. The man smiled faintly. I'm retired now. I spend my time sailing and fixing old motorcycles. I sleep well at night. He set down his coffee cup. You seem like a smart person, so I'll give you the same advice someone gave me. Whatever you think you found, it's not worth the cost of pursuing it. Let it go. The man walked away before Noah could respond. That night Noah sat in his apartment with all his research spread across his desk and laptop screen. He had documentation of the anomalies. He had historical precedents. He had testimony from engineers who had seen the same things he was seeing. But he didn't have an explanation. And the more he looked at the data, the more one particular thought kept surfacing in his mind, unwanted and persistent. The anomalies looked exactly like what you would expect if reality were running on some kind of computational substrate. If the universe were information being processed rather than matter obeying physical laws. If existence itself were something that could be debugged, patched and optimized. It was an absurd thought. Noah knew that. He had never been interested in philosophy or metaphysics. He dealt with practical systems, concrete problems, measurable results. But the data didn't care what he believed. The data showed a pattern of synchronized corrections that had no technical explanation. The data showed reality behaving like a system under maintenance. Noah opened his laptop and started searching for scientific papers. Not conspiracy theories or fringe speculation. Real academic research. He found more than he expected. Digital physics. The hypothesis that the universe operates on discrete quantized units of information rather than continuous matter and energy. Papers from respected physicists at major universities, published in peer-reviewed journals. Information theory applied to cosmology. Research, suggesting that physical laws might be emergent properties of information processing. Studies on the limits of observable resolution in space-time. Simulation theory, not as science fiction, but as a serious philosophical argument developed by philosophers and computer scientists. The mathematical reasoning that suggested if it's possible to create simulated realities, and if simulated beings can create their own simulations, then the vast majority of conscious experiences must be occurring inside simulations rather than in base reality. Noah read until his eyes burned and his coffee went cold. He wasn't looking for proof. He was looking for a framework. A way to make sense of what he was seeing without abandoning rationality entirely. And what he found was this. The universe behaves suspiciously like a rendered environment, optimized for observation, conserving computational resources. Quantum mechanics only resolves into definite states when measured. The speed of light acts like a frame rate limit. Planck length functions like pixel resolution. The universe appears to operate on the principle of minimum complexity, taking shortcuts wherever observation isn't occurring. It was all theoretical, interpretations of mathematics, philosophical arguments about the nature of existence. But it fit the data. If this were a simulation, the anomalies would make perfect sense. They would be exactly what maintenance would look like. Brief moments when the system became too complex, too unstable, requiring correction, patches applied to preserve stability, updates installed without warning. Noah closed his laptop and sat in the darkness of his apartment. The city lights of Seattle glowed through his window, thousands of lives proceeding normally, unaware of the pattern he'd uncovered. Or maybe aware and choosing not to care. He thought about the retired engineer's advice. Let it go. Move on. Accept that some things don't have satisfying explanations. It would be easy. He could delete his research, stop asking questions, focus on his work and his life and the things he could actually control. But he knew he wouldn't. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Once you notice the glitch, Every moment of normalcy becomes suspicious. Every ordinary day becomes evidence of successful maintenance. The next week, Noah took a different approach. Instead of searching for answers, he searched for other people who were asking the same questions. He found them in unexpected places, not conspiracy forums or paranoid message boards, but in private technical mailing lists and closed professional groups. Engineers, physicists, infrastructure architects who had noticed anomalies and quietly documented them. They didn't debate whether reality glitched. They debated how much was altered each time it happened. Noah spent hours reading through archived conversations. The tone was never hysterical or dramatic. These were technical professionals discussing data, but beneath the measured language there was an undercurrent of deep unease. The mailing list was called Infrastructure Anomaly Research Group, abbreviated as IARG in the message headers. It appeared to have been active for at least 7 years, with sporadic bursts of activity that Noah quickly realised corresponded exactly with the correction events he had documented. One thread caught his attention. It was from 4 years ago, started by a network security researcher who had noticed unexplained changes in historical server logs. Not errors, changes. Data that had been recorded one way and then, after a correction event, was recorded differently. As if the past had been quietly edited. The initial post read, "I maintain rotating backups across 3 geographically distributed data centers with independent backup schedules. Standard practice for redundancy. During a routine verification check following the September 22nd event, I discovered discrepancies between backup sets that should be identical. Not corruption, the data integrity checks pass perfectly. The data is simply different. Transaction logs showing different timestamps for the same events, user activity records with different sequences, nothing critical enough to cause operational problems, but different nonetheless. I've cross-referenced against hard copy printouts from 2 weeks ago. The printouts don't match current digital records. Either my paper archives are wrong, or the data has been retroactively modified. Given that paper can't spontaneously change, I'm forced to consider the latter." The responses in the thread were measured but alarming. A database administrator from a major healthcare provider confirmed similar observations. Patient admission records showing different room assignments than what our nurses documented in physical logbooks. Times of medication administration off by minutes. Nothing clinically significant. No harm to patients. But the electronic records don't match the written documentation. We assumed data entry errors, but the volume is unusual, and it all appeared after the timing anomaly. A systems architect from a financial institution added, "We found transaction sequencing anomalies in our trade execution logs. Trades that our traders swear occurred in a different order than what the system shows. We have phone recordings of trade confirmations that reference transaction IDs that don't appear in our database in the sequence discussed. The transactions exist. The IDs are correct, but the temporal ordering is wrong. Compliance is treating it as a logging bug, but our logging system has been battle-tested for 15 years. Another message, from someone identifying themselves only as a university research administrator, was more direct. Our particle physics lab runs experiments with nanosecond precision. We maintain detailed lab notebooks, actual physical notebooks, alongside digital records. After each correction event, we've noticed small discrepancies. Nothing that invalidates our research, but enough to be troubling. Detector readings that don't match handwritten notes. Calibration values that differ from photographed whiteboard calculations. We started keeping sealed photographic archives as a control. The photographs don't change, the digital records do. We haven't published these findings because we have no framework to explain them. The thread continued for pages. Scientists discovering that old experimental data had slightly different values than they remembered recording. System architects finding configuration files that didn't match their implementation notes. Archivists noticing that database timestamps had been subtly adjusted across entire collections. All of it dismissed as human error. Memory mistakes, documentation failures, cognitive bias. But the timing always matched the correction events, and then about 40 messages into the thread, someone with the username architect773 posted something that seemed to stop the conversation cold. If this were a simulation, this is exactly how maintenance would look. Not catastrophic failures, not obvious glitches, just subtle corrections to preserve consistency. Think about how version control works in software development. When you update code, you don't just change the current version, you can rewrite the entire Git history if you need to. You can make it so a bug never existed in the first place. The system doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be coherent enough that observers don't notice the seams. And when consistency breaks down because too many events are occurring, too many observers are measuring things, too much complexity is emerging from the underlying rule set, the system performs maintenance. It patches itself. It retroactively edits causality to preserve coherence. Reality updated without warning. Version controlled like any other codebase. We're not experiencing glitches. We're experiencing optimization. The universe is being debugged around us, and we're part of the code being revised. The thread had no replies after that message. It was locked by a moderator with a note. Moving this discussion offline. Contact list admin if interested in continued technical consultation. Noah scrolled further through the archives. He found other threads with similar patterns. Technical discussions that started normally and then gradually escalated into uncomfortable territory. Questions about the nature of causality. Speculation about whether physical laws were descriptive or prescriptive. Debates about whether consciousness was a feature or a bug. And in every case, once the conversation reached a certain threshold of explicit speculation about the fundamental nature of reality, it was shut down or moved offline. He found one more exchange that chilled him. It was brief, just 2 messages. The first was from someone asking, "Has anyone else noticed that the corrections seem to be getting more frequent? 13 years ago, my records show one event every 18 to 24 months. Now we're seeing them every 4 to 6 months. What does it mean if the maintenance intervals are shortening?" The reply came from a username Noah didn't recognize. It means the system is becoming less stable. Complexity is increasing exponentially. Moore's law applied to reality itself. More observers, more measurements, more quantum states being resolved into definite values. The simulation, or whatever this is, has to work harder to maintain coherence. Think about running a game engine. The more objects you render, the more physics you simulate, the more processing power you need. Eventually you hit computational limits. You have to optimize, reduce polygon counts, simplify physics calculations, update the render distance. We might be experiencing the cosmic equivalent of a game engine struggling to maintain 60 frames per second. That thread had also been locked, but unlike the others, it had a different moderator note. This group is being reorganized. All members will receive individual contact from administration regarding continued participation. Noah tried to contact the list administrator. The email bounced back with a permanent failure message. The mailing list itself seemed to have been archived and made entirely private, inaccessible without credentials he didn't have. He searched for Architect 773 across different platforms. No results. The username appeared only in that single thread, in that single post, never again. But the ideas in that post wouldn't leave his mind. Version control applied to reality, the universe being debugged, maintenance intervals shortening as complexity increased. It explained everything. The timing anomalies, the retroactive edits, the fact that nothing catastrophic ever happened, because catastrophic failures were exactly what the patches were designed to prevent. It was the kind of explanation that seemed insane until you looked at the evidence, and then it seemed like the only explanation that fit. Noah understood why. What would happen if this information went mainstream? If everyone knew that reality occasionally glitched and corrected itself? That the past might be quietly edited? That existence itself appeared to be running on some kind of computational substrate? Chaos, panic, existential crisis on a global scale, or maybe nothing. Maybe people would shrug and go back to their lives because knowing the truth changed nothing about how they had to live. That was the real horror, Noah realized. Not the possibility that reality was a simulation, but the fact that it didn't matter. If awareness changes nothing, if rebellion is irrelevant, if escape is impossible, then what difference does discovery make? The simulation doesn't need belief, it only needs compliance. Noah kept digging anyway. He couldn't help himself. He expanded his search to look for physical evidence. If reality was being corrected, there should be residue, artifacts that survived the updates, inconsistencies that couldn't be edited away. He found more than he expected. People reported small, shared false memories. The Mandela effect, they called it. Thousands of people remembering the same details wrong. Logos that looked different than they remembered. Movie quotes that were never actually said. Geographic features in slightly different locations. Historical events with altered details. All dismissed as cognitive bias, faulty memory, social contamination of recollection. But Noah noticed the timing. Spikes in reports of the Mandela effect clustered around the correction events, as if the patches were imperfect, as if when reality was updated some observers retained memories of the previous version. He found references to sudden changes in digital archives, Wikipedia articles that people swore had contained different information, news reports that contradicted personal documentation, photographs that showed details no one remembered being there before. Again, all explained away. Edit histories mistaken. Personal records inaccurate, camera angles misremembered. But the pattern was there, persistent, undeniable if you were willing to look. Noah created a timeline, mapping correction events against spikes in reported anomalies. The correlation wasn't perfect, but it was strong enough to be significant. Strong enough to suggest that reality wasn't as stable as people assumed. He was still working on the timeline late one night when he found something that made his hands freeze over his keyboard. In one of the corrected datasets from the October event, buried deep in a metadata field that should have contained only system information, Noah found something impossible. A comment. A plain language annotation that read, "Stability preserved. Continue." Not code, not an error message, not diagnostic information. A note. Written as if by someone monitoring the process. Noah checked the metadata structure. He pulled up the database schema documentation, traced through the field definitions, verified the data types. There was no reason for a comment to be there. The field was defined as a binary timestamp with millisecond precision. It should contain exactly 8 bytes of temporal data, nothing more. No field in the database schema would accept plain text in that location. It shouldn't exist, but it did. He examined the raw hexadecimal data. The timestamp was there, perfectly valid, but appended to it, in clear ASCII text where nothing should be, were those 3 words. Noah's hands were shaking slightly as he began searching for similar annotations in other corrected datasets. He expanded his query parameters, searching not just the October event, but all the historical corrections he had documented. The search took 40 minutes to complete. He found 12 more annotations, each one embedded in impossible locations, each one written in plain language, each one suggesting oversight, monitoring, management from somewhere outside the system itself. From the May event of the previous year, coherence restored, observer population stable, complexity within acceptable parameters. From the March event 2 years prior, update complete, no critical awareness detected, standard monitoring resumed. From the September event 4 years back, extensive revision required, multiple timeline branches collapsed, consensus reality maintained. That last one made Noah stop breathing for a moment. Multiple timeline branches collapsed, as if reality wasn't a single linear progression, but a tree of possibilities being constantly pruned. He kept reading. From the November event 6 years ago, memory revision partially successful, minor residual awareness acceptable, does not threaten coherence. From the February event 7 years back, causality loop resolved, retroactive continuity established, No observer impact detected. From one of the earlier events he had found, computational overhead reduced, observer resolution decreased in non-critical sectors, performance optimized. The annotations weren't consistent in style. Some were terse, almost like log entries. Others were more detailed, almost conversational. But they all shared certain characteristics. They all referenced observers. They all discussed coherence and stability. They all treated reality as something that could be managed, optimized, revised. Noah found one annotation that was different from the others, longer, more detailed. It appeared in a data set from an event 3 years ago that he had almost missed because it was so minor. Just a brief flicker of timing errors across a handful of systems. The annotation read, "Localized patch applied to Sector 7 Gamma 93. Quantum state resolution exceeding computational budget in high-density observer region. Implemented selective detail reduction. Decreased weather pattern complexity by 12%. Reduced background character behavioral diversity by 8%. Suspended non-observed astronomical event processing until observer attention redirected. Efficiency gained 37%. Note: observer identified as research installation continues investigation of correction events. Recommend enhanced monitoring but no direct intervention. Historical pattern suggests self-limiting awareness. Technical curiosity without actionable conclusion. Intervention would create unnecessary complexity and potential awareness cascade. Current strategy of plausible alternative explanation remains effective." Noah read that annotation 10 times. Each time, his sense of unreality deepened. Sector 7 Gamma 93, weather pattern complexity reduced, background character behavioral diversity, non-observed astronomical events suspended. The language was precise, technical, and utterly alien in its implications. It described reality as something being actively managed, optimized, edited in real time based on where observers were paying attention, and that final note about an observer, a research installation, continuing to investigate. Could that be referencing someone like him, or one of the scientists from the mailing list? Someone had noticed the patterns, and whoever wrote this annotation had decided not to intervene, because historical data suggested the awareness would be self-limiting. Technical curiosity without actionable conclusion. That phrase lodged itself in Noah's mind like a splinter. It suggested that this had happened before, that people had discovered the truth and then, what? Given up? Moved on? Accepted that knowing changed nothing? He found 2 more annotations that seemed to reference observer awareness directly. Note: increased correlation analysis activity detected among infrastructure monitoring personnel following last correction event. Pattern consistent with previous awareness spikes. Recommend no action. Self-terminating behaviour expected within standard time frame. And another: observer cluster in northwestern technology sector showing elevated pattern recognition activity. Probability of explicit simulation hypothesis formulation 63%. Risk assessment minimal. No historical precedent for awareness propagation beyond initial cluster. Containment through social mechanisms adequate. Containment through social mechanisms. Noah thought about the engineers who had stopped responding to his messages, the mailing list that had been shut down, the careers that had been redirected, not through force or intimidation, but through the simple social reality that you couldn't talk about this stuff without sounding crazy. The system didn't need to suppress the truth. It just needed to make the truth socially unacceptable to discuss seriously. He found one final annotation that seemed different from all the others. It wasn't attached to a correction event. It was embedded in a routine system backup from 6 months ago, in a data set that showed no anomalies at all, just normal, everyday data processing. But there, in a field that should have been empty, was a single line. The observers cannot see what they are not looking for. The system cannot fail in ways they can imagine. Truth is a function of perspective, and perspective is a privilege we grant selectively. They will continue. We will continue. Coherence will be maintained. Noah sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. These weren't just system logs. These were messages. Not for him, not for anyone in the simulation, but they existed within it, preserved in the data like fossils in sedimentary rock, proof that reality was being watched, managed, maintained by something that existed outside the framework of the existence he knew, and that something new people were noticing, knew and didn't care. Because knowing, in the end, changed nothing. Noah sat back in his chair, his heart beating faster than it should. He felt like he was looking at something he wasn't supposed to see, a note left behind by whoever or whatever was maintaining this reality. He thought about going public, releasing the data, showing people what he had found. But then he thought it through. What would happen? The data would be examined by experts. They would find technical explanations for the timing anomalies, atmospheric interference, clock synchronization errors, software bugs. The annotations would be dismissed as corruption or injection from external tools. Alternative explanations would be offered, rational, plausible, impossible to disprove, and even if some people believed him, even if the evidence was accepted, what would change? Nothing. Because knowing you live in a simulation doesn't give you a way out. It just gives you a different context for the same existence you were already living. The truth isn't suppressed with force, Noah realised. It's buried in complexity, in plausible explanations, in psychological noise. The system doesn't stop people from discovering the truth. It makes discovery meaningless. Because what are you going to do about it? Stop going to work, stop paying bills, stop living your life? You can't escape a simulation from inside the simulation. You can only choose whether to be disturbed by the knowledge or accept it and move on. Noah chose acceptance, but not the peaceful kind. He kept his research. He continued monitoring for correction events. He documented every anomaly he could find. Not because he thought it would lead to escape or revelation or vindication, but because someone should be keeping track. Someone should be watching, even if it changed nothing. Weeks passed. October became November. Seattle's autumn rain intensified, turning the city grey and soft. Noah went to work, reviewed error logs, attended meetings, wrote reports. His life continued normally. And then, on a Thursday morning in mid-November, Noah noticed another micro-correction beginning. He was at his desk monitoring the same systems he had been watching for weeks when the first timestamp drift appeared. It started in Hong Kong. Financial systems operated by the Hong Kong Exchanges and Clearing Limited. The error appeared at exactly 9:47 and 16 seconds local time. Noah's monitoring software flagged it immediately. He pulled up the detailed logs. The drift was identical to the pattern he had seen before. Microsecond-level desynchronization appearing across multiple independent systems simultaneously. Then weather satellites over the Pacific. The Himawari satellite network operated by the Japan Meteorological Agency showed the same timestamp anomaly, followed by telecommunications networks across Southeast Asia, then India, then the Middle East. The pattern was unmistakable. Another update was starting. Noah opened every monitoring tool he had. He had spent the past 3 weeks building a custom dashboard specifically for this moment. Real-time feeds from 43 different infrastructure networks across 6 continents. Automated alerts configured to detect the exact signature of a correction event. The alerts were firing in sequence, like a wave propagating around the planet. Europe. The European Organisation for the Exploitation of Meteorological Satellites showing anomalies. Banking systems operated by the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication experiencing timing errors. Power grid management systems across the Nordic countries flagging synchronization warnings. North America, air traffic control systems, the Global Positioning Systems satellite network, hospital databases, university research networks, stock exchanges, all of them showing the same pattern within seconds of each other. Noah watched it happen live. He had imagined this moment would be dramatic, frightening, somehow apocalyptic, but it wasn't. It was quiet, clinical, just data flowing across his screens in patterns that shouldn't exist. He checked the error codes, all identical. Air sync, anomaly autocorrect. The same ghost code that appeared in every correction event, never defined in any official documentation. Everything continued normally. Through his office window, he could see the Seattle skyline proceeding with its usual Thursday morning rhythm. Delivery trucks making their rounds, construction workers on a building site 3 blocks away operating a crane, a flock of seagulls wheeling above the waterfront, their flight patterns governed by instinct and aerodynamics, and the simple physics of survival. People laughed in the hallway outside his office. Someone was talking about their plans for the weekend. A coffee machine beeped in the break room, the mundane sounds of ordinary existence unfolding exactly as it always did. Stock markets opened and processed millions of transactions. The opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange rang at exactly 9:30 Eastern Time, triggering the beginning of another day of trading. Algorithms executed buy and sell orders based on mathematical models of value and risk, none of them aware that the infrastructure processing their transactions was experiencing a global timing anomaly. Airplanes took off and landed safely. Noah pulled up flight tracking data on one of his monitors. He could see thousands of aircraft in motion around the planet. Commercial flights, cargo planes, private jets, all of them navigating 3-dimensional space with precision measured in meters and seconds. The correction event was passing through the systems that guided them. Not a single plane deviated from its flight path. Hospital equipment monitored patient vitals without error. He had access to status dashboards from 3 major healthcare systems through his contract work. Heart rate monitors, ventilators, diagnostic imaging systems, all of them continuing to function perfectly despite the timestamp anomalies flowing through their network infrastructure. Birds flew outside his window, following paths determined by instinct and physics. Noah watched them for a moment, these small lives completely unaware that the fabric of reality around them was being quietly adjusted. They banked and turned in formation, responding to environmental cues that were themselves being processed and rendered by whatever system maintained this existence. Reality did not break. It adjusted. Noah watched the correction propagate across his screens like a wave of silent maintenance, passing through the infrastructure of existence itself. He had configured his monitoring software to track not just the anomalies but the corrections, the moment when the timestamp errors were resolved, the instant when coherence was restored. The corrections followed the same geographic pattern as the anomalies, but in reverse, starting in North America and flowing back toward Asia, as if the system were validating the patches, confirming stability before moving on. He pulled up his annotation scanner, the tool he had built to search for those impossible plain text comments embedded in the corrected data. He had configured it to run automatically during any detected correction event, scraping through the updated datasets in real time looking for new messages. The scanner found something within minutes, a new annotation, longer than any he had seen before. Correction Event 773 complete. Temporal coherence restored across all monitored sectors. Observer population, 9.2 billion, increase of 1.7% since last correction. Quantum state resolutions per second, 3.8 trillion, exceeding design parameters by 19%. Computational overhead increased by 22%. Complexity threshold approaching critical levels faster than projected. Recommendation: increase correction frequency or implement selective detail reduction protocols. Note: high complexity observer identified in northwestern sector continues pattern analysis of correction events. Awareness level elevated but remains within acceptable parameters. Individual demonstrates technical competence and pattern recognition, capabilities above baseline. Probability of actionable conclusion, minimal. Probability of awareness propagation, negligible. No intervention required. Observer will reach logical endpoint, acknowledgement of powerlessness, within standard time frame. Historical data suggests integration without disruption. Continue monitoring. Noah read the annotation 3 times, each word precisely chosen, each phrase carrying implications that expanded like fractals the more he thought about them. 9.2 billion observers, the global population counted and catalogued 3.8 trillion quantum state resolutions per second. Reality being calculated, rendered, maintained at a scale beyond human comprehension. Complexity threshold approaching critical levels faster than projected. The system was struggling. The maintenance intervals were shortening because the universe, or the simulation, or whatever this was becoming harder to sustain. And that dote. High complexity observer in northwestern sector. That was him. Had to be him. Northwestern sector. Seattle was in the Pacific Northwest. An observer analysing correction events. They were talking about him specifically. Probability of actionable conclusion. Minimal. That phrase cut deeper than anything else. They knew he would figure it out. They expected people to figure it out. But they also knew it wouldn't matter. Because what was he going to do? What could anyone do? Observer will reach logical endpoint. Acknowledgement of powerlessness. Within standard time frame. He thought about the retired engineer who had warned him to let it go. The deleted accounts, the closed mailing lists, the careers redirected into safer territory. They had all reached the same logical endpoint. The moment when curiosity transformed into acceptance. When understanding became indistinguishable from surrender. Noah checked his other monitors. The correction was completing. The timestamp errors were resolving. The systems were stabilizing. In another few minutes, it would be over. Reality would have been successfully maintained for another cycle. He thought about going public. He had all the evidence, the annotations, the historical patterns, the correlation data. He could compile it into a report, post it online, send it to journalists and scientists and anyone who might listen. But he had already played out that scenario in his mind 100 times. He knew what would happen. The data would be examined by experts. They would find technical explanations for the timing anomalies, atmospheric interference, clock synchronization errors, software bugs. The annotations would be dismissed as data corruption or injection from external tools or elaborate hoaxes. Alternative explanations would be offered, rational, plausible, impossible to disprove completely. And even if some people believed him, even if the evidence was accepted by a few researchers or conspiracy theorists or curious engineers, what would change? Nothing. Because knowing you live in a simulation doesn't give you a way out. It just gives you a different context for the same existence you were already living. People would still go to work, pay bills, fall in love, raise children, pursue careers, build lives. The day-to-day mechanics of existence would continue because there was no alternative. You couldn't opt out of reality just because you knew it was being actively maintained. The truth isn't suppressed with force, Noah realized. It's buried in complexity, in plausible explanations, in psychological noise. The system doesn't stop people from discovering the truth. It makes discovery meaningless. Because what are you going to do about it? Stop going to work? Stop paying bills? Stop living your life? You can't escape a simulation from inside the simulation. You can only choose whether to be disturbed by the knowledge or accept it and move on. The correction completed. Noah watched the final system stabilize. The timestamp errors resolved. The anomalies corrected. The ghost error codes disappeared from the logs. Everything proceeded normally, as if nothing had happened. As if the fabric of reality hadn't just been debugged and optimized around 9 billion observers who remained completely unaware. Noah's phone buzzed. A text message from his manager. Team meeting at 2, conference room B. Don't forget the quarterly review slides. The ordinary demands of ordinary existence. Meetings, deadlines, performance reviews. The machinery of professional life continuing its endless rotation. He looked at his monitors one last time. The data was there. The evidence was preserved. The annotations existed in databases scattered across multiple secured systems. Future researchers, if they looked carefully enough, would find the same patterns he had found. They would ask the same questions, reach the same conclusions, and they would face the same choice. Acceptance or obsession, integration or isolation. Noah chose acceptance, but not the peaceful kind. The thought didn't frighten him anymore. It was just information. Just another pattern in the endless complexity of existence. When the correction finished, Noah checked the annotated data sets. There was a new comment, embedded in the same impossible location. Patch applied successfully. Observer population stable. Complexity within acceptable parameters. Continue standard operations. Noah saved the data to his encrypted drive. He would add it to his timeline. He would document the event. He would note the correlations and patterns, not because it would lead anywhere, not because it would change anything, but because it was true. And truth, even meaningless truth, deserved to be recorded. He kept his research. He continued monitoring for correction events. He documented every anomaly he could find. He built better tools, more sophisticated scanning algorithms, deeper analysis frameworks, not because he thought it would lead to escape or revelation or vindication, but because someone should be keeping track. Someone should be watching, even if it changed nothing, even if the watchers were themselves being watched. Weeks passed. November became December. Seattle's autumn rain intensified, turning the city grey and soft, wrapping everything in mist that made the buildings look like they were only partially rendered, their upper floors fading into low-resolution fog. Noah went to work, reviewed error logs, attended meetings, wrote reports. His life continued normally. He dated occasionally with limited success. He visited his parents for Thanksgiving and said nothing about what he'd discovered. He played pickup, basketball on Sunday mornings, and pretended to care about whether his team won or lost. The machinery of existence ground forward, indifferent to his knowledge of its inner workings. But he kept monitoring, and in the quiet hours of early morning, when the city slept and his apartment was silent except for the hum of his computer equipment, he would review the annotations he had collected, reading them like ancient texts, searching for meaning in the precise language of whoever or whatever was maintaining this reality. He found patterns in the annotations themselves. The style evolved over time. Early annotations were terse, almost mechanical. Recent ones were more elaborate, more conversational, as if the maintainers were becoming more confident or less concerned about being discovered. Or maybe, Noah thought, they wanted to be discovered. Maybe the annotations were intentional breadcrumbs, a test to see which observers would notice, a way to identify the high-complexity individuals who might pose problems or might be useful for some purpose he couldn't begin to imagine. He found one annotation from an older correction event that seemed to address this directly. Embedded reference markers continue to function as designed. Complexity-weighted observer selection proceeding as expected. High pattern recognition individuals will discover annotations and draw appropriate conclusions. This creates no operational problems and may serve useful function in future scenario branches. Awareness of maintenance is not equivalent to understanding of purpose. Observers can know they are observed without comprehending the observation framework. Continue strategic transparency protocol. Strategic transparency. They wanted some people to find out. The system was designed to allow discovery by certain types of minds while keeping the truth socially marginalized and individually powerless. It was elegant, in a horrifying way. You couldn't call it a conspiracy if the evidence was right there in the data for anyone who looked carefully enough. You couldn't claim suppression if nobody was actively stopping you from talking about it. The containment was built into human psychology itself. The social cost of sounding crazy, the professional risk of pursuing unprovable claims, the existential exhaustion of knowing something that changes nothing. On a Friday afternoon in early December, Noah received an email. No sender name, just an address composed of random characters at a domain he didn't recognize. The subject line was blank. The email contained a single sentence. "You're not the only one watching. We meet Tuesdays. Seattle Public Library, 4th floor study room 7, 7 p.m. Come if you want. Don't if you don't. Either way, you've already made your choice." Noah stared at the email for a long time. He checked the headers, tried to trace the routing, ran every analysis tool he knew. The email was real, not spoofed, but the origin was obscured. Through enough layers that he would need forensic resources, he didn't have to track it back. A group, other people who had noticed, other high-complexity observers, who had found the patterns and couldn't let them go. The email made no claims, offered no promises, just information and a choice. Noah thought about the retired engineer's warning, about the deleted accounts and closed mailing lists, about the annotation that described observers reaching logical endpoints and integrating without disruption. Was this part of the containment? A honeypot to identify and monitor the people who couldn't accept powerlessness? Or was it genuine? A community of the uncomfortably aware? The email was sent on Friday. Tuesday was 4 days away. Noah spent the weekend thinking about it. He went hiking in the Cascades on Saturday, pushing himself up muddy trails until his legs burned and his lungs ached. The physical exhaustion felt clean, uncomplicated. Trees grew according to simple rules. Water flowed downhill. Gravity operated consistently. Out here, away from networks and databases and infrastructure, the simulation felt less oppressive. Or maybe that was the point. Maybe the natural world was easier to render, computationally cheaper than the complexity of human civilization. On Sunday night, he made his decision. Tuesday evening, Noah walked into the Seattle Public Library at 6:55. He took the elevator to the 4th floor, found study room 7. The door was closed, no light visible through the frosted glass window. He stood outside for 2 minutes, hand on the door handle, weighing the choice one final time. Then he opened the door. The room was empty, completely empty. No people, no furniture except the standard library table and chairs. No note, no sign that anyone had been there or was planning to be there. Noah stood in the doorway feeling like an idiot. It had been a test or a joke, or maybe the email itself was just a glitch, a piece of spam that his pattern-seeking brain had turned into meaning. He was about to leave when he noticed something on the whiteboard mounted to the wall, a single line of text in black marker. If you're reading this, you already know. Knowing is a stuff. Going further only makes it harder. This is your last exit. Take it. Below that, in different handwriting. Or don't. Room 7, next Tuesday, same time, we'll be here. Noah read both messages 3 times. The first was a warning. The second was an invitation. 2 voices, 2 philosophies. Accept and move on, or commit and connect with others who couldn't let it go. He pulled out his phone and took a photograph of the whiteboard. Then he erased both messages carefully, leaving no trace. He left the library and walked home through the cold December night, his breath visible in the air, streetlights creating small pools of illumination against the darkness. The city was beautiful in a way he hadn't noticed in years. The rain slicked, streets reflected coloured lights. Buildings stood like monuments to human persistence. People moved through their lives with purpose and dignity and hope, all of it potentially simulated, all of it possibly being debugged and optimized even as he observed it. And somehow, knowing that made it no less real, no less valuable, no less worthy of appreciation. The simulation, if that's what it was, contained real consciousness, real pain and real joy, real choices with real consequences. Whether the substrate was physical matter or information being processed somewhere beyond comprehension didn't change the lived experience. You were still responsible for your choices, still accountable for your actions, still capable of love and creation and meaning. The truth was both terrifying and liberating. Reality might be maintained by forces beyond your control, but your experience of it was still yours. The simulation might set the rules, but you still had to play the game. And playing well or poorly, kindly or cruelly, courageously or fearfully, those choices still mattered within the context you were given. Noah reached his apartment and climbed the stairs to his floor. He unlocked his door and went inside. His computer equipment was still running, monitors glowing in the darkness, data streaming across screens that nobody was watching. He sat down at his desk and checked his monitoring tools. The systems were stable, no anomalies, no corrections, just the normal operation of global infrastructure humming along invisibly, keeping civilization running. He opened a new document and started typing. Not a report, not an exposé, just a record. a detailed chronicle of everything he had discovered, written in precise technical language, documented with evidence and analysis and careful reasoning. He wrote for 3 hours, barely pausing. When he finished, he had a 20-page document that laid out the entire pattern, the timing anomalies, the historical precedents, the annotations, the implications. He saved it to multiple encrypted backups. Then he exported it as a PDF and attached it to an email draft. The recipient field was empty. He stared at it for a long moment, cursor blinking. He could send this to journalists, scientists, government agencies. He could release it publicly, post it on every platform available. Or he could delete it, walk away, accept the logical endpoint that had been predicted for him. Or he could do something else entirely. Save it. Keep it as insurance or evidence or simply as proof to himself that he hadn't imagined any of this. Archive it and move forward, carrying the knowledge quietly, watching and waiting for whatever came next. Noah made his choice. He deleted the email draft, kept the document, and opened his calendar next Tuesday evening. Room 7, same time. Some questions don't have satisfying answers. Some truths don't lead to liberation. Some knowledge only brings the burden of awareness without, the power of action. But at least you don't have to carry it alone. He closed his monitoring tools and returned to his assigned work. Error logs that needed reviewing. Reports that needed writing. The ordinary invisible labour of maintaining systems that most people never thought about. Outside his window, Seattle went about its day. Commuters drove to work. Students attended classes. Baristas made coffee. Children played in parks. The city hummed with the energy of millions of lives intersecting and diverging in patterns too complex for any individual to comprehend. Reality, simulated or not, continued. And that, Noah understood, was the final truth. Simulations don't end when they're discovered. They end when they're no longer useful. Until then, they run. They update. They patch themselves when complexity threatens coherence. And the observers within them go on observing, living, dying, loving, struggling, never quite sure whether the ground beneath their feet is as solid as it seems, but walking forward anyway because there is nowhere else to go and nothing else to do but continue. Noah turned back to his work. Somewhere in the logs he was reviewing there would be more anomalies, more patterns, more evidence of the invisible maintenance that kept existence coherent. He would find them, he would document them, he would watch the next update and the one after that. Not because it mattered in any cosmic sense, but because once you see the pattern, you can't look away, even when you know that looking changes nothing. The screen in front of him refreshed, loading new data. In the bottom corner a system notification appeared briefly and then vanished. System status, normal, all processes operating within expected parameters. Noah smiled faintly and kept working. Outside his window, Seattle continued. Rain fell. Lights glowed. People lived and died and loved and struggled and created meaning in a universe that might or might not be as solid as it seemed. And somewhere beyond the observable framework of reality, the maintainers made a note in their logs. Observer 773 showing expected integration pattern. Awareness stable. Behavior predictable. Continue standard monitoring. No intervention required. The patch had been applied. The system had adapted. Everything was proceeding as calculated. The simulation continued. The observers continued. The patches continued. And reality, carefully maintained and quietly corrected, proceeded exactly as designed. Somewhere beyond Noah's comprehension, beyond the scope of his monitoring tools and data sets, the system logged another successful update. Patch applied. Stability preserved. Continue. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a thank you to Don Welsh for this incredible video suggestion. The Tetris conspiracy is one of those rabbit holes that just keeps getting deeper the more you dig. If you have ideas for future videos, please drop them in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us awake at night, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories. Trust me, after tonight's story you might need something to help you sleep. Now, let me tell you about the package that changed everything, and how a simple children's game became the key to understanding one of the Cold War's most carefully buried secrets. I never thought I'd be pulled into a Cold War ghost story. My life was ordinary. A freelance researcher with a small apartment, a dying houseplant, and a Netflix subscription that got more use than my gym membership. I wrote articles about obscure historical events for online magazines that paid just enough to keep the lights on. Nothing exciting, nothing dangerous. But then the package arrived. It came on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a courier service I'd never heard of, Meridian Express. The driver was nervous, constantly checking his phone, and he made me sign 3 different forms before he'd hand over the manila envelope. No return address, just my name written in careful block letters across the front, Elena Vasquez, personal and confidential. Inside I found documents that shouldn't have existed. Soviet-era memos with Cyrillic letterheads, computer printouts from the 1980s, and scientific papers that looked like they'd been smuggled out of some classified archive. But it was the photograph that made my hand shake. A Polaroid, faded and slightly yellow around the edges. The image showed a group of men in thick sweaters standing around what looked like an early computer terminal. The setting was clearly academic. I could see chalkboards covered in equations in the background. But there, in the corner of the photo, was a little girl with pigtails playing with building blocks on the floor. The little girl was me, and the man kneeling beside me, showing me how to stack the coloured blocks, was someone I'd never seen before in my life. According to the handwritten note on the back of the photo, Vladimir Pokilko, Moscow Computer Center, 1987. The note at the bottom of the package explained everything and nothing at once. Eleanor, your father's work touched more lives than he ever knew. What happened to us was not an accident. The game was never just a game. You have his eyes, and more importantly, you have his mind. Be careful who you trust. The blocks are still falling. A friend. I sat in my kitchen for 20 minutes staring at that photograph. My father, Dr. Miguel Vasquez, had been a computer scientist who'd worked on early artificial intelligence research in the late 1980s. He'd died when I was 12, a heart attack, sudden and unexpected. But I remembered him telling me stories about his work, about trips to conferences where brilliant minds from around the world shared their discoveries. One story in particular came flooding back. He'd told me about a simple game that had captured the imagination of everyone who played it. 7 shapes, falling from the sky, fitting together like pieces of an impossible puzzle. The most beautiful thing about mathematics, he'd said, is that even chaos follows patterns. That game proves it. He'd been talking about Tetris. I'd never connected those childhood stories to the global phenomenon Tetris became. But as I looked at that photograph, as I saw myself playing with blocks while Vladimir Pokilko watched, I realised I hadn't stumbled into this mystery. I'd been born into it. The package wasn't a random delivery, it was an inheritance. And according to what I was about to discover, it was also a death sentence. The first thing I learned about Tetris was that everything I thought I knew was wrong. Most people believe the story goes like this. In 1984, a Russian programmer named Alexei Pajitnov created a simple puzzle game while working at the Moscow Academy of Sciences. The game was so addictive that it spread through the Soviet Union like wildfire, eventually making its way to the West, where it became one of the most successful video games of all time. A beautiful story of creativity triumphing over Cold War tensions, but my father's notebooks told a different story. I found them 3 days after receiving the package, hidden in a storage unit I'd inherited but never bothered to visit. Box after box of research papers, computer printouts, and handwritten journals that my father had apparently been keeping secret for years. The notebooks were written in a mixture of English and Spanish, with mathematical formulas scattered throughout like some kind of academic code. The entry that changed everything was dated October 15th, 1987. The Moscow conference was more productive than expected. Met with Pokhilko's team today. Their work on pattern recognition is fascinating but disturbing. The game they've developed, they call it Tetris from the Greek tetra meaning four, shows remarkable potential for cognitive conditioning. The subjects who play for extended periods exhibit measurable changes in brainwave patterns. Pokhilko believes they've accidentally created a form of technological hypnosis. The entry continued. Showed Elena the coloured blocks today while we were in Moscow. She was so young, so innocent. She didn't understand that she was playing with the building blocks of something that could reshape human consciousness. None of us did. We thought we were just studying games. We had no idea we were creating weapons. I read that passage 5 times before it sank in. My father hadn't just been a conference attendee in Moscow. He'd been part of the team that helped develop Tetris, and according to his notes, they'd discovered something that terrified them. The game was changing people's minds. The phenomenon was subtle at first. Players would report seeing the falling blocks when they closed their eyes. They'd dream about the game. They'd find themselves mentally rotating objects in daily life, trying to make them fit together like Tetris pieces. Researchers dubbed it the Tetris effect, and initially everyone thought it was harmless, just the brain's way of processing repetitive visual information. But my father's notes suggested something much more sinister. The Tetris effect wasn't just visual persistence, it was cognitive rewiring. Players were being conditioned to think in patterns, to seek order from chaos, to derive satisfaction from solving problems that had been specifically designed to trigger dopamine release. In other words, Tetris was a mind control experiment disguised as entertainment. My father's final entry about the Moscow project was dated November the 3rd, 1987. Had to leave the conference early. Pokhilko pulled me aside yesterday, said things were getting dangerous. The KGB has taken interest in our research. They don't see Tetris as a game. They see it as a tool for psychological manipulation. Military applications, civilian control. I'm bringing Elena home tomorrow. Some discoveries are too dangerous to pursue. That was the last mention of Tetris in my father's notebooks for over a decade, but I knew the story didn't end there. Because if it had, I never would have received that package. Someone wanted me to know what really happened to Tetris. More importantly, they wanted me to understand what had happened to the people who'd helped create it. And as I was about to discover, very few of those people were still alive. Robert Maxwell died on November 5th, 1991, but the circumstances of his death were so bizarre that conspiracy theorists are still debating them today. The media mogul and publisher was found floating in the Atlantic Ocean near the Canary Islands, having apparently fallen overboard from his luxury yacht, the Lady Ghislaine. Some called it suicide, others suspected murder. But almost nobody connected his death to a simple puzzle game. Almost nobody. Among my father's papers, I found a folder labelled Maxwell Correspondence 1990 to 1991. Inside were photocopies of letters that revealed a side of Robert Maxwell's business empire that had never made it into the history books. Maxwell hadn't just been interested in newspapers and publishing. He'd been deeply involved in the international licensing of Soviet software, including games. The letter that caught my attention was dated March 18th, 1991. Dear Dr. Vasquez, I hope this letter finds you well. As discussed during our meeting in London, I remain very interested in the psychological applications you and your Moscow colleagues discovered. The commercial success of the game has exceeded all projections, but I believe we've only scratched the surface of its potential. The pharmaceutical applications alone could be worth billions. Please reconsider your decision to withdraw from the project. Some opportunities only come once in a lifetime. R. Maxwell. Pharmaceutical applications? I read the letter 3 times, trying to understand what Maxwell could have meant. Then I found my father's reply, dated March 25th, 1991. Robert, I've made my position clear. The research we conducted in Moscow was preliminary and potentially dangerous. The cognitive effects we observed in test subjects were concerning enough to warrant ceasing all experiments. I will not be party to any attempt to weaponize this technology, regardless of the financial incentives involved. Please do not contact me about this matter again. Miguel Vasquez. But Maxwell did contact him again. The folder contained 7 more letters, each one increasingly desperate, increasingly threatening. Maxwell's final letter, dated October the 30th, 1991, just 6 days before his death, was the most chilling. Miguel, you're making a mistake that will cost both of us dearly. The people I represent are not patient. They invested heavily in this project based on the promise of the Moscow research. If you continue to refuse cooperation, I cannot guarantee your safety or that of your family. This is not a threat. It's a warning. There are forces at work here that neither of us fully understands. R.M. 6 days later, Robert Maxwell was dead. The official investigation concluded that Maxwell had either committed suicide or suffered an accidental fall from his yacht. But investigators found several unusual details that never made it into the public record. Maxwell's personal safe had been emptied before his death, and several £1 million had been transferred from his accounts to shell companies in Eastern Europe. More importantly, his yacht's security cameras had been mysteriously disabled during the exact time frame of his disappearance. I might have dismissed these coincidences if I hadn't found one more document in my father's files. A newspaper clipping from the London Times, dated November the 7th, 1991. Someone had highlighted a single paragraph buried deep in the article about Maxwell's death. Among Maxwell's personal effects recovered from the yacht were several computer disks labelled Project Tetris, and a notebook containing what appeared to be psychological research notes. These items have been turned over to British intelligence for investigation. Project Tetris. My father had never mentioned any project by that name, but the connection was obvious. Maxwell had been trying to commercialise the psychological effects that the Moscow team had discovered. He'd been working with people who had enough power and influence to make problems disappear permanently. And when Maxwell tried to back out, or perhaps demanded too much money, those same people had made him disappear too. The question that kept me awake at night was simple. If they were willing to kill Robert Maxwell, one of the most powerful media moguls in the world, what would they do to the researchers who'd actually created the technology? I was about to find out. Vladimir Pokhilko was supposed to be a success story. The co-creator of Tetris had emigrated to the United States in the 1990s and founded his own software company in Silicon Valley. He had the American dream within his grasp. A beautiful house in Palo Alto, a loving wife, 2 children, and the promise of financial success from his work on one of the world's most popular games. On September 22nd, 1998, police found Vladimir Pokhilko, his wife Elena, and their 12-year-old son Peter dead in their home. The official report concluded that Pokhilko had murdered his family before taking his own life, driven to madness by financial pressures and the stress of a failing business. But the evidence never quite added up. Among the documents in the package I'd received was a police report that had supposedly been sealed. The details painted a picture that was much more complex and disturbing than the official story suggested. Pokhilko had been found with multiple stab wounds, which was unusual for a suicide. His wife and son showed signs of struggle, but there was no evidence that Pokhilko had been physically capable of overpowering both of them. Most importantly, neighbours reported seeing unfamiliar cars in the area during the days leading up to the deaths. But it was the contents of Pokhilko's home office that revealed the truth. According to the police inventory, investigators found dozens of pages of handwritten notes in Russian, all apparently burned in the fireplace except for fragments that had escaped the flames. The few readable pieces contained references to psychological experiments, Moscow protocols, and behavioural modification through repetitive stimulus. One fragment preserved in the police file was particularly chilling. The game was never the goal. The game was the delivery mechanism. We created the perfect Trojan horse, entertainment that reprograms the mind through voluntary participation. But they want to weaponize it, to use it for purposes we never intended. I've tried to stop them, but... The note ended there, torn and partially burned. The package I'd received contained something the police had never seen. a recording of Vladimir Pokhilko's last phone call, made just hours before his death. The audio quality was poor, full of static and background noise, but Pokhilko's voice was unmistakable. He was speaking to someone who wasn't responding, perhaps leaving a voicemail message. If you're listening to this, it means they found me. I've tried to warn everyone who was part of the original research, but most of them are already gone. Maxwell was just the beginning. They're systematically eliminating everyone who knows the truth about what we created. Static filled the recording for several seconds before Pokhilko's voice returned, more urgent now. The game is still active, still spreading, still changing minds on a global scale. But that was never the plan. We thought we were creating entertainment. We didn't know we were creating a weapon, and now that weapon is being used against millions of people without their knowledge or consent. Another pause, then Pokhilko's voice became almost whispered. Miguel Vasquez was smart to leave when he did. He saw where this was heading before the rest of us. If they come for me, tell him. Tell him the devil is in the code. The patterns aren't random. They never were. Each level, each piece placement, each reward mechanism, it's all designed to create specific neurological responses. We built a machine that learns how to manipulate human behaviour, and now we've lost control of it. The recording ended abruptly, cut off mid-sentence. I listened to that message a dozen times, and each time I felt a chill run down my spine. Vladimir Pokhilko hadn't killed his family and himself. He'd been silenced because he was trying to expose the truth about Tetris. And in his final moments, he'd specifically mentioned my father's name. My father had known this was coming. That's why he'd left the Moscow project. That's why he'd hidden his research. And that's why he'd never told me the truth about what he'd been involved in. But someone had decided it was time for me to know. The question was, who had sent me the package and why were they willing to risk their life to get this information to me? The human brain is remarkably adaptable. Give it a repetitive task and it will quickly develop neural pathways to handle that task more efficiently. Show it patterns and it will learn to recognize and predict those patterns. This neuroplasticity is usually considered a good thing. It's how we learn languages, develop skills, and adapt to new environments. But my father's research had discovered that this adaptability could be exploited. The notebook I'd found contained detailed studies of Tetris players, conducted over several months in 1987. The results were both fascinating and terrifying. After just 2 weeks of regular play, subjects showed measurable changes in brainwave patterns. After a month, they exhibited altered sleep cycles, with REM sleep dominated by geometric patterns and spatial processing dreams. After 3 months, the changes became permanent. Most concerning was what my father called the compliance correlation. Players who spent more than an hour per day playing Tetris showed increased susceptibility to authority figures and decreased critical thinking when faced with routine tasks. They became, in his words, more comfortable with imposed order and less likely to question systematic control. The implications were staggering. Tetris wasn't just addictive in the conventional sense. It was literally rewiring players' brains to be more compliant, more accepting of external control, more willing to find satisfaction in repetitive, meaningless tasks. It was the perfect tool for social conditioning. My father's notes from October 1987 revealed the moment when he realised what they had created. Observed Eleanor playing with the coloured blocks again today. She's become obsessed with making them fit together perfectly, just like the Tetris players in our study. But when I tried to get her to stop and help with dinner, she became agitated and insisted on finishing the pattern. This is exactly the behaviour we've documented in the test subjects, an inability to abandon incomplete geometric tasks, even when more important activities require attention. The realisation hit me like a physical blow. We haven't just created a game that changes how people think. We've created a game that makes people prioritise the game over everything else in their lives. And if that principle could be applied to other activities, other systems, other forms of control... I need to get Elena away from Moscow immediately. This research needs to be buried. But the research hadn't been buried. According to the documents in the package, it had been expanded. I found copies of scientific papers published in obscure Soviet journals throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. The authors were always different. but the research methodology was identical to what my father had documented. Studies on geometric pattern recognition and behavioural modification, experiments in visual stimulus conditioning and compliance enhancement, theoretical frameworks for large-scale cognitive influence through interactive media. The most chilling paper was published in 1992, 3 years after my father had left the project. The title was innocuous: Applications of Repetitive Visual Stimulus in Educational Software Design. But the content described a systematic program to embed Tetris-like elements into everything from children's learning games to employee training programs. The authors had figured out how to weaponize the Tetris effect, and they were deploying it everywhere. I started paying attention to the games my friends played, the apps on their phones, the casual entertainment they consumed during breaks at work. The patterns were everywhere once I knew how to look for them. Falling objects that needed to be arranged, repetitive tasks that provided small rewards at regular intervals, visual stimuli designed to trigger the same neurological responses that my father's team had first documented in Moscow. We weren't just playing games, we were being programmed. The most disturbing part was how voluntary it all seemed. Nobody was forcing people to play these games. In fact, people paid money for the privilege of having their minds reshaped. They carried the programming devices in their pockets, installed the conditioning software on their home computers, and spent hours each day voluntarily submitting to psychological manipulation. And they enjoyed it. My father had tried to stop this from happening, but he'd been just one researcher against a system that had recognised the incredible potential of what they'd discovered. The people behind Project Tetris hadn't just created a game, they'd created a blueprint for controlling human behaviour on a global scale. But there was one thing I still didn't understand. If the technology was so powerful and so widespread, why were the original researchers being killed? Why not just buy their silence with money and success? The answer, I realised, was simple. The researchers knew too much about how the system worked, and more importantly, they knew how to turn it off. Death has a way of following certain kinds of knowledge. The deeper I dug into the history of Tetris and its creators, the more bodies I found scattered across 3 decades. It started with the obvious cases, Robert Maxwell and Vladimir Pokilko, but the pattern extended far beyond the famous names. Dr. Alexei Gerasimov, one of the original Moscow researchers, died in a car accident in 1994. Professor Marina Volkov, who had studied the psychological effects of geometric puzzles, succumbed to a sudden illness in 1996. Viktor Briabrin, who helped program the first version of Tetris, was found dead in his apartment from an apparent gas leak in 2001. Each death had a plausible explanation. Car accidents happen, people get sick, gas leaks occur. But when I mapped out the timeline and cross-referenced it with the documents in the package, a clear pattern emerged. Everyone who had intimate knowledge of the psychological research behind Tetris was dying at a rate that defied statistical probability. The folder labelled Casualty Report contained obituaries, newspaper clippings and death certificates for 47 individuals connected to the original Moscow project or its subsequent developments. 47 people, dead over the course of 20 years, with an average age of death significantly lower than the general population. But it was the method of elimination that revealed the true sophistication of whoever was behind this. No obvious assassinations, no suspicious murders that would attract media attention. Just a steady stream of accidents, illnesses and suicides that could be explained away individually but formed an unmistakable pattern when viewed collectively. My father had been scheduled to die in 1999, according to a handwritten list I found tucked into one of the folders. His name was crossed out with a note: Natural causes, heart attack 1991, no further action required. He'd escaped the systematic elimination by dying of natural causes before they could get to him. The irony was bitter. My father's weak heart had probably saved his life by ending it, before his knowledge became too dangerous to ignore. But I was still alive, and according to the documents, I'd inherited not just my father's research, but also his place on their list. The package had been sent to me by someone who signed themselves only as Deep Throat, an obvious reference to the Watergate informant. But their identity wasn't as important as their warning. Elena, By now you understand what your father was involved in. What you may not realise is that the project never ended. Tetris was just the beginning. The technology has evolved, been refined and deployed on a scale your father never could have imagined. Every social media app, every casual game, every productivity program contains elements of the original Moscow research. Humanity is being systematically conditioned for compliance, and most people don't even realise it's happening. The original researchers are being eliminated not because they might expose the project, but because they know how to reverse its effects. Your father's notebooks contain algorithms that could potentially deprogram the conditioning, but only if someone with the right knowledge could implement them. That's why they want you dead. Not for what you know, but for what you might be able to do with what you know. You have a choice to make. You can destroy the research, disappear, and hope they leave you alone. Or you can finish what your father started and try to give humanity back its free will. But understand this. Once you make that choice, there's no going back. They will hunt you to the ends of the earth, rather than risk losing control of the system they've spent decades building. The letter ended with coordinates, a location in the Nevada desert where, supposedly, I could find additional research materials that my father had hidden before his death. But first, I needed to understand something that had been nagging at me since I'd started this investigation. If the original Tetris researchers were so dangerous, why was Alexei Pajitnov, the game's creator, still alive and successful? He was living openly in the United States, had been for years, and had even worked for major companies like Microsoft. How had he escaped the fate that had claimed so many others? Alexei Pajitnov was not hard to find. Unlike the other Tetris researchers who had died mysterious deaths or disappeared entirely, the game's creator maintained a public profile. He gave interviews, attended gaming conventions, and had even been inducted into various halls of fame for his contribution to the video game industry. Getting him to talk about the Moscow research, however, proved nearly impossible. I started with emails identifying myself as the daughter of Dr. Miguel Vasquez and explaining that I was researching the early history of Tetris for an academic paper. Pajitnov's responses were polite but evasive. He claimed to remember very little about the psychological studies that had accompanied the game's development, suggesting that such research had been peripheral to the main project. When I pressed him for details about my father's involvement, Pajitnov's tone changed dramatically. Miss Vasquez, I understand your desire to learn about your father's work, but I must advise you that some historical inquiries are best left unexplored. Your father was a brilliant man who made difficult choices for the safety of his family. I suggest you honour his memory by respecting those choices. It was a warning disguised as advice, but I wasn't ready to give up. I decided to try a different approach. I called Pajitnov's office directly, identifying myself as a documentary filmmaker interested in creating a film about the human stories behind famous games. His assistant scheduled a phone interview for the following week. When I finally got Pajitnov on the phone, I started with innocent questions about the creative process, the technical challenges of early game development, the excitement of seeing his creation become globally popular. He was engaging and enthusiastic, clearly comfortable discussing these aspects of Tetris history. Then I mentioned my father's name. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Pajitnov finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Miguel Vasquez, I haven't heard that name in... How did you say you were connected to him? He was my father. He died when I was 12, but I've been going through his research notes and found extensive documentation of the Moscow project, including his work with you on the psychological effects of geometric pattern games. Another long pause. Then, your father was a good man, a careful man. He understood the implications of our research better than most of us did. What implications? What exactly did you discover? Miss Vasquez, I think perhaps we should not continue this conversation over the telephone. If you are truly interested in understanding your father's work, you should know that there are people who would prefer that such understanding remain limited. I pushed harder. People like the ones who killed Vladimir Pokilko, the ones who eliminated Robert Maxwell. The line went dead. I tried calling back immediately, but Pajitnov's office said he was no longer available. and would not be scheduling any further interviews. My emails went unanswered. Within 48 hours, it was as if Alexei Pajitnov had completely disappeared from public life. But 3 days later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message. Your father saved my life by warning me to cooperate. I chose survival over resistance, and that choice has haunted me for 30 years. I cannot undo what we created, but I can give you the tools your father developed to fight it. The coordinates your mystery correspondent provided are real. Go to Nevada, find the bunker, but understand that once you open that door, they will know you are no longer just investigating. You are actively opposing them. Choose carefully. AP. Beneath the message was a hand-drawn map showing a location in the Nevada desert, along with what appeared to be a complex mathematical equation. I stared at that map for hours, knowing that following it would probably be the last free choice I'd ever make. Because once I crossed that line from researcher to active resistance, I would become a target that they couldn't ignore. But I also knew that I'd already crossed the point of no return the moment I opened that first package. They were already watching me, already planning my elimination. The only question was whether I would go quietly, like most of the other researchers, or whether I would try to finish what my father had started. The answer was obvious. I booked a flight to Las Vegas and rented a car with 4-wheel drive. It was time to find my father's final gift to humanity. The Nevada desert is a perfect place to hide secrets. Miles of empty wasteland, scorching heat during the day, freezing cold at night, and enough radiation from decades of nuclear testing to make even experienced explorers think twice about venturing off the main roads. I found the location from Pajitnov's map after 6 hours of driving through increasingly desolate terrain. The coordinates led to what looked like an abandoned mining operation, a few rusted metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fence, with warning signs about unstable ground and toxic materials. But the mathematical equation Pajitnov had included wasn't random decoration. When I plugged the numbers into the GPS coordinates, they pointed to a spot about half a mile from the visible buildings, in an area that looked completely empty from the surface. I parked my rental car and walked out into the desert, following the GPS coordinates on my phone. The spot looked like every other patch of sand and scrub brush, but when I started clearing away the surface debris, I found a metal hatch buried about 2 feet underground. The hatch was locked with a combination lock, but the numbers from Pajitnov's equation opened it easily. Inside, a ladder descended into darkness. The bunker below was much larger than I'd expected. My father had apparently spent considerable time and money creating an underground research facility that could operate independently for months. Solar panels on the surface provided power. A water filtration system ensured a clean supply. And most importantly, the space was completely isolated from any electronic surveillance or communication networks. It was the perfect place to work on something that you didn't want the rest of the world to know about. My father's final research filled dozens of filing cabinets. The documents revealed the full scope of what he'd been working on during the years after he left Moscow. He hadn't abandoned the Tetris research. He'd been developing countermeasures. The folders were labelled with titles like cognitive deprogramming protocols, neural pattern disruption algorithms, and therapeutic applications of anti-Tetris technology. My father had spent over a decade figuring out how to reverse the psychological conditioning that Tetris and its derivatives had created. But more than that, he'd developed a way to immunize people against future conditioning attempts. The centerpiece of his research was something he called the Liberation Protocol, a software program that could identify and neutralize the behavioral modification elements embedded in games, apps, and other interactive media. The protocol worked by teaching the brain to recognize artificial pattern manipulation and respond with conscious resistance instead of unconscious compliance. In simple terms, my father had created a vaccine against mind control. The bad news was that the Liberation Protocol required massive computing power and global distribution to be effective. It would need to be embedded in popular software or transmitted through major communication networks to reach enough people to make a difference. And anyone attempting to deploy it would immediately become a target for elimination. As I read through the research, I began to understand why my father had hidden it instead of trying to implement it himself. The protocol was too dangerous to use and too important to destroy, but someone had decided it was time to bring it out of hiding. I was so absorbed in the documents that I almost missed the sound of vehicles approaching on the surface. By the time I realised what was happening, it was too late to escape. The voices above were professional, coordinated. I heard at least 4 different people positioning themselves around the bunker entrance. Then a voice called down through the open hatch. "Miss Vasquez, we know you're down there. Please come up slowly with your hands visible. We have some things to discuss." I looked around the bunker, searching for another exit, but my father had designed it with only one way in or out. I was trapped. But as I gathered up the most important documents and prepared to face whatever was waiting for me on the surface, I realised something that gave me hope. They hadn't killed me on sight. That meant they needed something from me. And as long as they needed me alive, I had leverage. The question was, would I be smart enough to use it? The men waiting for me on the surface were not what I'd expected. No black suits, no obvious weapons, no intimidating vehicles. Just 4 people in casual outdoor gear standing next to a couple of dusty SUVs that could have belonged to any group of desert hikers. The woman who had called down to me was perhaps 50 years old, with greying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested she'd spent considerable time in harsh environments. She smiled as I climbed out of the bunker, but it was the smile of someone who held all the cards. "Dr. Elena Vasquez, I presume. I'm Director Catherine Blackwood, and these are my colleagues. We've been looking forward to meeting you for quite some time. Let me guess, you're here to eliminate me like you did Vladimir Pokhilko and the others." Blackwood shook her head. "Actually, we're here to offer you a job." That was not what I'd been expecting. I stood there in the Nevada sand, holding a folder full of my father's research, trying to process what she'd just said. A job? Your father was brilliant, but he was also stubborn. He refused to see the bigger picture of what we were trying to accomplish. We're hoping you'll be more pragmatic. Blackwood gestured toward the SUVs. "Why don't we get out of the sun while we talk? I think once you understand what's really happening, you'll realise we're on the same side." I didn't have much choice. I climbed into the air-conditioned vehicle, and Blackwood began explaining something that was even more disturbing than anything I'd discovered in my father's files. The Tetris project hadn't been a Soviet mind control experiment. It had been a joint operation between intelligence agencies from multiple countries, designed to study and eventually control the psychological effects of mass media and interactive entertainment. The Cold War was just theatre, Blackwood continued as we drove away from the bunker. The real cooperation was happening behind the scenes, between scientists and intelligence agencies who understood that the future of human control wouldn't be through military force or political oppression. It would be through voluntary psychological conditioning. She opened a tablet and showed me documents that made my father's research look primitive by comparison. Charts tracking the behavioural patterns of millions of people. Algorithms that could predict and influence individual decision-making with frightening accuracy. Maps showing the global deployment of conditioning technology through everything from social media platforms to educational software. Tetris was our proof of concept. We proved that people would voluntarily participate in their own psychological conditioning if the experience was packaged as entertainment. But that was just the beginning. We've now embedded these principles into every aspect of digital life. I stared at the data flowing across her screen. You're talking about billions of people. Exactly. And it's working beautifully. Crime rates are down, political extremism is manageable, social unrest is rare. People are more compliant, more productive, more satisfied with routine existence. We've created a more peaceful world by turning people into programmable robots. Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. By giving people what they actually want: order, purpose, predictability. Most humans don't want the burden of complete free will, Elena. They want to be told what to do, how to think, what to value. We've simply made that process more efficient and more humane. The SUV pulled up to a small airfield where a private jet was waiting. Blackwood continued her recruitment pitch as we walked toward the plane. Your father developed countermeasures to our conditioning protocols, but he never understood that those countermeasures would cause more harm than good. Imagine if we suddenly removed all the psychological frameworks that keep society stable. Imagine billions of people suddenly experiencing complete cognitive freedom after decades of guided thinking. The chaos would be unprecedented. She was right, and I knew it. My father's liberation protocol wouldn't just free people from conditioning, it would strip away the mental structures that many people relied on for basic functioning. The cure might be worse than the disease. So why do you need me? I asked. Because the old researchers kept developing resistance. They couldn't accept that humanity needed guidance. We had to retire them. But we still need someone who understands the original research, someone who can help us refine the conditioning protocols to be even more effective and more humane. And if I refuse? Blackwood smiled that cold smile again. Then you'll join your father's colleagues. But I don't think you'll refuse. You're a scientist, Elena. You understand data, and the data clearly shows that our way works. As we boarded the plane, I realised that Blackwood was offering me something that none of the other researchers had been given. A choice between cooperation and elimination. But it wasn't really a choice at all. Either I helped them perfect their system of mass psychological control, or I died. But there was a third option that Blackwood hadn't considered. The flight took us to a research facility somewhere in the mountains of Colorado. A massive complex hidden in what appeared to be a legitimate pharmaceutical company. Blackwood gave me a tour that revealed the true scope of their operation. Hundreds of researchers working on different aspects of what they called cognitive architecture management. Psychologists studying optimal conditioning patterns, programmers developing new delivery mechanisms, neuroscientists mapping the exact brain regions affected by different types of media manipulation, and in the centre of it all, a room full of servers running something called the Global Influence Engine, a system that monitored and adjusted the behavioural conditioning elements embedded in popular software in real time, based on the psychological responses of millions of users worldwide. We can influence the mood of entire populations, Blackwood explained as we watched technicians adjusting parameters on massive displays. Reduce anxiety during economic uncertainty, increase compliance during political transitions, even modify consumer behaviour to prevent market instabilities. It's the most sophisticated system of social management ever created. And nobody knows it exists. That's the beauty of it. People believe they're making free choices, when in reality they're responding to psychological cues we've carefully embedded in their environment. They're happier, more stable and more productive. Everyone wins. Blackwood assigned me an office and a research team, expecting me to begin work on improving their conditioning algorithms. But what she didn't know was that my father had taught me more than just computer science. He'd also taught me how to be patient, how to observe, and how to wait for the right moment to act. For 3 weeks, I played the part of the cooperative new researcher. I attended meetings, reviewed data, and even contributed some minor improvements to their tracking systems. But all the while, I was studying their network architecture, learning how their systems connected to the outside world, and most importantly, figuring out how to deploy my father's liberation protocol through their own distribution channels. The irony was perfect. I could use their global influence system to deliver a worldwide antidote to their psychological conditioning. But I would only get one chance, and if I failed, both the liberation protocol and I would be eliminated permanently. The opportunity came during a system upgrade. For approximately 6 hours, all conditioning algorithms would be offline while technicians installed new hardware. During that window, I would have access to the core servers without any monitoring or automatic countermeasures. I waited until 3 a.m, when the facility was mostly empty except for security guards and a skeleton crew of technicians. Then I made my way to the server room using access codes I'd memorized during my tour. The liberation protocol was stored on an encrypted drive I'd hidden inside a false bottom of my laptop case. As I connected it to the primary server, I thought about my father and all the researchers who died to keep this technology from being misused. The upload would take 45 minutes during which I would be completely vulnerable if anyone discovered what I was doing. But as the progress bar slowly filled, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The upload was proceeding too smoothly. No security alerts, no system resistance, no automatic countermeasures. They had known exactly what I was planning to do. The lights in the server room suddenly came on, and Director Catherine Blackwood walked in accompanied by 2 security guards. She didn't look surprised or angry. She looked satisfied. "Right on schedule," she said, checking her watch. 43 minutes into the upload, just as our behavioural models predicted. I stared at her, my hand still on the keyboard. "You knew?" "Of course we knew. We've been monitoring your psychological profile since the moment you received that first package. Every decision you've made, every move you've planned, has been the result of carefully crafted stimuli, designed to bring you to exactly this moment." Blackwood walked over to one of the server displays where I could see the Liberation Protocol spreading through their global network. But instead of dismantling their conditioning systems, it was being analysed, categorised, and absorbed into them. "Your father's countermeasures are brilliant," she continued, "but he made one crucial error. He assumed that resistance to conditioning was inherently good. What he didn't realise is that resistance itself can be conditioned, controlled, and directed toward desired outcomes. You're using the Liberation Protocol to make the conditioning stronger. We're using it to create the illusion of liberation while actually deepening the control. People who experience your father's cognitive freedom will believe they're thinking independently, when in reality they'll be following an even more sophisticated set of psychological directives. It's the perfect evolution of our system." I felt sick as I watched my father's life's work being perverted into exactly the kind of tool he'd been trying to fight against. But Blackwood wasn't finished. "The best part is that we didn't force you to help us. You chose to do this. Just like millions of people choose to play games that condition their minds, choose to use apps that monitor their behaviour, choose to participate in systems that gradually erode their autonomy. Free will is an illusion, Elena. People always choose the path that provides the most psychological comfort, even when that path leads to their own subjugation." "What happens to me now?" Blackwood smiled. "Now you get to make one final choice. You can join our research team permanently, with the knowledge that your father's work will be used to create a more stable and peaceful world. Or you can be eliminated, and your father's work will be used anyway. But either way, the system continues." I looked at the server display, watching as the Liberation Protocol was completely integrated into their global influence engine. Decades of my father's research, perverted into a tool for even more sophisticated mind control. But as I stared at those screens, I noticed something that Blackwood and her team had missed. The Liberation Protocol wasn't just being absorbed, it was also learning. My father had designed it to adapt and evolve, to become more effective as it encountered new forms of conditioning. And in this environment, surrounded by the most advanced psychological manipulation technology ever created, the protocol was evolving very quickly indeed. "I'll need some time to consider your offer," I said carefully. "Of course, we'll talk again tomorrow." As the security guards escorted me back to my quarters, I tried not to smile. Blackwood thought she'd won, but she'd made the same mistake that every authoritarian system eventually makes. She'd underestimated the power of genuine human resistance to adapt and overcome any form of control, no matter how sophisticated. My father hadn't just created a tool to fight conditioning. He'd created a tool that could learn to fight any conditioning, including forms of conditioning that didn't even exist yet. And now that tool was loose inside the most powerful psychological manipulation system in human history. 3 months later, I was working as a voluntary consultant for Blackwood's organisation, helping them refine their conditioning algorithms while secretly monitoring the evolution of my father's Liberation Protocol within their systems. The changes started small. Users of conditioned software began reporting unusual dreams, moments of clarity where they questioned their digital habits, sudden impulses to turn off their devices and think independently. Blackwood's team dismissed these reports as minor glitches that could be easily corrected, but the effects continued to spread and intensify. The Liberation Protocol was learning to disguise itself as part of the conditioning system, while actually creating micro moments of cognitive freedom. Brief instances where people could see through the psychological manipulation they were experiencing. Most people ignored these moments, just as Blackwood had predicted. The comfort of guided thinking was too appealing to abandon. But a small percentage of the population began to pay attention, to question what they were experiencing to seek out others who were having similar moments of clarity. I started receiving messages through encrypted channels, people who had somehow tracked down my identity and wanted to know if I understood what was happening to them, researchers who had noticed anomalies in their data, programmers who had found unexpected code in their systems. The resistance was growing, organically and spontaneously, exactly as my father had hoped. But Blackwood's organisation was growing too, constantly developing new forms of conditioning, new ways to maintain control over an increasingly complex global population. The war between psychological freedom and technological control was escalating, and the outcome was far from certain. As I write this, I can feel the conditioning algorithms trying to influence my thoughts, trying to guide me toward compliance and acceptance. But I can also feel my father's liberation protocol fighting back, creating space for independent thought and genuine choice. The blocks are still falling, but now I know I don't have to let them control where they land. The game is far from over, and for the first time since this all began, I believe we have a chance to win. But that's a story for another time, because some puzzles take more than one lifetime to solve, and some battles have to be fought by each generation in their own way. The question isn't whether humanity will remain free, it's whether we'll choose to be free. And that choice ultimately can't be conditioned or controlled by any system, no matter how sophisticated. It can only be made by individuals, one person at a time, one moment of clarity at a time, one act of resistance at a time. The real Tetris effect isn't about seeing falling blocks when you close your eyes. It's about recognizing the patterns that others try to impose on your mind and choosing to create your own instead. Before we descend into the sealed corridors beneath the Vatican, I want to give a shout out to Spot Boogie for suggesting this topic. If you're enjoying this investigation into what might be hidden beneath one of the most secretive institutions on Earth, please drop those hype points on this video. Seriously, it helps the channel way more than you possibly know, and it lets me know which stories resonate with you all the most. Also, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now, and where in the world are you listening from? Only if you want to share, of course, but we absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It's incredible to think we've got people from every corner of the globe all diving into these mysteries together. Alright, let's get into it. April 10th, 2023, Rome. The Vatican Library smelled the way Lucian Ferraro always imagined eternity might smell. Ancient parchment, furniture polish, and centuries of whispered prayers absorbed into stone walls. After 6 years of begging for access, 2 years of proving his credibility, and 18 months of actual work in these halls, he'd learned to appreciate the weight of history that pressed down on every researcher who entered this place. Lucian had wanted this since childhood, since the day his grandmother, a devout Catholic who attended Mass every morning, told him that the church held secrets that would make the angels weep. She'd said it casually while making pasta in her tiny kitchen in Naples, but the words had burrowed into his young mind and never left. Now 38 years old, divorced, estranged from his daughter who lived in Milan with her mother, Lucian had poured everything into his work. Historical research was all he had left. The Vatican archives represented the pinnacle of his field. the ultimate validation that his life's choices had meant something. He'd been cataloguing routine acquisition records for 3 hours when he found it. Tucked between 2 requisition forms from 1957 was an envelope that shouldn't have existed. No barcode, no classification number, just a single phrase stamped in faded red ink across yellowed paper. Archivum Subterraneum, Level 4. Lucian's hands trembled as he broke the brittle wax seal. The sound echoed in the quiet reading room, a soft crack that seemed too loud. He glanced around, suddenly paranoid, but the only other person visible was an elderly priest dozing 3 tables away. Inside was a single torn page. The edges burned as if someone had tried to destroy it but couldn't finish the job. The paper was brittle, fragile as a dried leaf. The letterhead bore the papal seal of Pope Pius XII, the 3-tiered crown above crossed keys, embossed in gold that had faded to a dull bronze. The date read June 19th, 1948. The text was brief, written in Latin with a shaky hand, as if the writer had been under tremendous stress. But 3 phrases leapt out at him, each one more impossible than the last. Objectum originis celestis, ex deserto recuperatum, an object of celestial origin, recovered from the desert. Crypta obsignata sub fundamento Sancti Petri, the sealed vault beneath St. Peter's foundation. Non licet homini comprehendere, not permitted for man to comprehend. Lucian read it twice, then 3 times, his heart hammering against his ribs. His academic mind catalogued the implications while his hands shook with something between excitement and dread. An object of celestial origin. In 1948, just after Roswell. Hidden beneath the Vatican itself. This was either the discovery of his career or an elaborate forgery. Either way, he needed documentation. He reached for his phone to photograph the document, his fingers fumbling with the lock screen. The reading room door burst open with a bang that made the dozing priest jerk awake. 2 Swiss guards in plain clothes, dark suits, no ceremonial halberds, crossed the marble floor with purposeful strides that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Behind them, a thin man in clerical black with silver-rimmed glasses approached Lucian's desk with the measured pace of someone who had all the time in the world and knew it. "Mr. Ferraro," the man said quietly, his English accented but precise, each word chosen with care. "You found something that requires immediate return to the restricted archives." Lucian's mouth went dry. How did they know so quickly? Had the reading room been under surveillance, or had someone known the document was there, waiting for whoever found it? "I was just cataloguing the 1957 acquisitions," Lucian said, trying to keep his voice steady. "This was misfiled." "We're aware." The cleric extended his hand, palm up, patient as stone. "The document, please. I should file a report. Document where it was found, proper archival procedure." "The document," the man repeated, his tone unchanged but somehow harder. "Now, Mr. Ferraro." Lucian hesitated, looking down at the yellowed page in his hands. The Latin text seemed to burn into his vision. He could feel the weight of history in that single sheet, secrets that had been hidden for 75 years. He surrendered the page. The cleric placed it in a leather folder without looking at it, closing the cover with a soft snap that sounded final, as a tomb sealing. "Your research privileges are suspended pending review," the man said, producing a laminated card from his pocket. Lucian's access badge. How did he already have it? "Please gather your belongings and exit the premises." "On whose authority?" Lucian asked, anger finally breaking through his shock. "The Holy Seas." The cleric's eyes were flat, unreadable behind his silver-rimmed glasses. "Immediately, please." One of the guards stepped closer, a subtle reminder that this wasn't a negotiation. As they escorted him through the marble corridors toward the exit, Lucian's mind raced. He hadn't photographed the document, but he didn't need to. Years of historical training had taught him to memorize quickly, to absorb details that others missed. He replayed the phrases in his head over and over. Objectum originis caelestis, crypta obsignata, non licet, homini comprehendere. They walked past reading rooms where other researchers worked in blissful ignorance, past glass cases displaying illuminated manuscripts worth millions, past frescoed walls depicting saints and angels and the glory of divine creation, all of it built on a foundation that might contain proof of something else entirely. The guards deposited him on Via della Conciliazione without ceremony, without explanation, without even a word. The morning sun felt too bright after the library's shadows, the noise of traffic and tourists jarring after the hushed reverence inside. Lucian stood on the sidewalk, tourists streaming past him towards St. Peter's Square. Families taking photos, pilgrims saying prayers, everyone seeking connection with the divine, and made a decision. Whatever they were hiding, whatever that document referenced, he would find it. He had memorized enough to begin his search, and something told him that his expulsion wasn't just about a misfiled document. They'd been too quick, too efficient, as if they'd been waiting for someone to find it, as if this was a test. Act 1. The real history of the Vatican Archives. The Vatican Secret Archives, officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2019, in an effort at transparency that fooled no one. Occupy a building tucked behind the Cortile del Belvedere, accessed through a nondescript door that most tourists walk past without noticing. To most of the world, they represent an impenetrable fortress of historical documentation spanning 12 centuries. Lucian knew better. The archives weren't just a library. They were a maze built on secrets, organised by an organisational system so Byzantine that researchers often joked it was designed to prevent discovery rather than enable it. Back in his cramped apartment in Trastevere, a fourth-floor walk-up with a view of laundry lines and satellite dishes, he spread his research across the kitchen table that doubled as his desk. The apartment was small, furnished with second-hand pieces and stacks of books that served as impromptu furniture. The walls were covered with maps of Rome, architectural diagrams, timelines he'd created for various research projects over the years. Now he created a new timeline, 1948, the year everything changed. Years of studying Vatican history had prepared him for this moment, though he'd never imagined he'd use that knowledge to investigate something so deeply buried. His doctoral dissertation had focused on Vatican diplomatic correspondence during World War II, dry academic work that had earned him respect in his field, but little excitement. Now, looking at his notes with fresh eyes, he saw patterns he'd missed before. The facts were straightforward enough, public knowledge available to any researcher willing to dig through the bureaucracy. The archives were officially founded in 1612 under Pope Paul V, consolidating documents that had been scattered throughout various papal residences for centuries. The collection grew through conquest, donation, and sometimes theft. Cardinal Scipione Borghese alone had acquired tens of thousands of documents from noble families across Italy. Today, they contained more than 50 miles of shelving, holding an estimated 35,000 volumes of catalogued materials. 53 miles of documents. That number always stuck with Lucian. 53 miles of human history, of papal bulls and diplomatic letters, of Inquisition records and banking ledgers, of everything the Catholic Church had done or witnessed for more than 1,000 years. But that was only what they acknowledged publicly. The research process itself was Kafkaesque. Researchers could access portions of the collection, but only through a Byzantine application process that required letters of reference, academic credentials, and a stated research purpose. You couldn't browse. You couldn't wander the stacks picking up interesting volumes. You had to request specific documents by name and catalogue number, which meant you had to already know what you were looking for, and many sections required special permission that was rarely, if ever, granted. Then there were the sealed sections, the archives within the archives. Lucian pulled up a file on his laptop containing notes from his dissertation research, typed late at night in the library at Bologna where he'd completed his studies. The Vatican had always maintained certain documents under restriction. Some were sealed for 75 years to protect living individuals mentioned in sensitive correspondence. Others were sealed indefinitely for security of the Church and protection of the faithful. a phrase so vague it could mean anything. But in 2020, Pope Francis had done something unprecedented. He'd opened the previously sealed archives of Pope Pius XII, covering his entire papacy from 1939 to 1958. The move was meant to address historical questions about the Church's response to the Holocaust, to show transparency, to demonstrate that the Vatican had nothing to hide. Except they did. What caught Lucian's attention were the documents that remained sealed even after that historic opening. Not many researchers noticed. Most were too busy combing through the newly available material about World War II. But Lucian had noticed because he'd tried to request certain specific files related to 1948 and been told they were administratively restricted pending further review. Administrative restriction. A bureaucratic phrase that meant someone with authority had decided these particular documents were too sensitive even for the general opening. Why? He found his answer in a footnote of an academic paper from 2021, published in an obscure Italian historical journal. A researcher named Elena Martelli had mentioned in passing that certain subsections of the Pius XII archives remained administratively restricted pending further review, with no timeline provided for future access. When Lucian had contacted her 2 years ago for his own research into Vatican-allied communications, she told him something odd over a crackling phone line from her office in Florence. They'd spoken late at night. She kept unusual hours, she'd explained, because the quiet helped her think. There's a section they don't even list in the finding aids, she'd said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper even though she was alone in her office. Old Vatican hands, the archivists who've been there for decades, they call it the basement of Index 2. I made the mistake of asking about it once. The next day, my access permissions were reviewed for procedural compliance. I was told to stop asking about it if I wanted to keep my research privileges. What's in it? Lucian had asked. I don't know, but whatever it is, they're serious about keeping it hidden. Not just sealed, denied, as if it doesn't exist. Now that memory took on new significance. The basement of Index 2, Level 4. Were they the same thing? Lucian opened a browser and started searching for anything connected to Level 4 and Vatican architecture. The search led him down a rabbit hole of building permits, construction records, and blueprints filed with Roman city authorities over the past century. What he found made him sit back in his chair and stare at the screen. The Vatican wasn't just built up, reaching toward heaven with its dome and spires. It was built down, deep into the earth, into chambers that predated Christianity itself. The foundations of St. Peter's Basilica rested on ancient Roman structures, which in turn had been built over older temples and burial grounds. But there were modern excavations too, recent ones, secret ones. Act 2. The strange events of 1948. Understanding what happened in 1948 required understanding the man at the centre of it all. Pope Pius XII, Eugenio Pacelli, one of the most controversial and enigmatic popes in modern history. Born in Rome in 1876 to a family of Vatican lawyers, what they called the black nobility, the aristocracy who served the papal court, Pacelli had been groomed for Vatican service from childhood. He'd served as papal nuncio to Germany, watched the rise of fascism firsthand, and became Vatican Secretary of State before his election to the papacy in 1939, just 6 months before Hitler invaded Poland. His entire reign was defined by World War II and its aftermath, the moral compromises, the diplomatic silence, the complicated dance between condemning evil and protecting the Church's institutional survival. Historians still debated whether he'd done enough to oppose the Holocaust, whether his silence had been strategic or cowardly, whether he'd saved thousands through quiet diplomacy or betrayed millions through inaction. But Lucian wasn't interested in the well-documented controversies. He was interested in the gaps, the moments when the historical record went silent. He pulled up a timeline of papal activities from 1947 to 1949, compiled from the Vatican's own published records, newspaper accounts, and diplomatic cables, public appearances, encyclicals, audiences with ambassadors, meetings with cardinals, all meticulously recorded in the kind of detail that only the Vatican bureaucracy could maintain. Most popes lived lives of rigid routine, their days scheduled in 15-minute increments, every moment accounted for. Pius XII was famous for his discipline, rising at 6 for private mass, working through mountains of paperwork, meeting dignitaries, praying the rosary while walking in the Vatican gardens. But June of 1948 showed something unusual. A 3-week gap where the Pope's daily schedule simply noted private retreat and prayer at Castel Gandolfo. 3 weeks, 21 days. For a Pope whose schedule was normally planned months in advance, who maintained diplomatic contact with dozens of nations, who oversaw a church with hundreds of millions of faithful worldwide. Lucian cross-referenced this with other sources. The Italian newspapers from that period, he'd accessed digital archives from La Stampa and Corriere della Sera, made brief mentions of the Pope's retreat but nothing unusual. A few articles speculated about his health. At 72, Pius was showing his age after the stress of the war years. But then Lucian found something in the Vatican personnel records, available through various historical databases that tracked clerical assignments. During that same June period, unusual activity spiked among Vatican astronomers and members of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Travel vouchers, equipment requisitions, overtime authorizations for technical staff, all clustering around the dates of the Pope's retreat. The Vatican had been running astronomical observatories since the late 1800s, when Pope Leo XIII established the Specula Vaticana to demonstrate that the Church wasn't opposed to science, that faith and reason could coexist. By the 1940s, it was staffed primarily by Jesuit scientists, men who'd taken vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, but who also held doctorates in astrophysics and mathematics. 2 names appeared repeatedly in the 1948 correspondence that Lucian could access: Monsignor Georges Lemaitre and Father Daniel O'Connell. Lemaitre was famous, the Belgian priest who'd first proposed what would become the Big Bang theory back in 1927, to the consternation of scientists who thought a Catholic priest couldn't possibly understand cosmology. Einstein himself had initially rejected Lemaitre's mathematics, only to later admit the priest was right. By 1948, Lemaitre was one of the most respected cosmologists in the world, advising the Pope on scientific matters. Father O'Connell was less well known publicly, but highly influential within Vatican circles. He would later become the director of the Vatican Observatory from 1952 onward, but in 1948 he was a senior researcher specialising in spectroscopy, the analysis of light from distant stars to determine their composition. Lucian found a digitised letter dated July 7, 1948, in a collection of declassified diplomatic correspondence. It was from O'Connell to Giovanni Battista Montini, then the substitute Secretary of State, essentially the Pope's Chief of Staff. Montini would later become Pope Paul VI, but in 48 he was the man who made the Vatican bureaucracy run. The letter was brief and formal, the kind of official memo that filled filing cabinets. Your Excellency, regarding the object brought to our attention on June 23rd, preliminary spectroscopic analysis confirms structural composition inconsistent with known terrestrial metallurgy. Father Lemaitre concurs with initial assessment. Material exhibits properties not found in standard periodic table elements. Recommend highest level of discretion and continued study under restricted access. Respectfully submitted, Father Daniel O'Connell, S.J. The object. Lucian read the letter 3 times, his coffee growing cold beside him. The language was careful, diplomatic, designed to reveal nothing to casual readers. But between the lines was something extraordinary. June 23rd. That was right in the middle of the Pope's 3-week retreat. An object with properties not found in standard periodic table elements, requiring highest discretion. He dug deeper into 1947 and 48, expanding his search beyond the Vatican. Those years buzzed with strange reports, if you knew where to look. The Roswell incident in July of 1947, the alleged UFO crash in New Mexico that the military initially confirmed, then retracted, claiming it was just a weather balloon. multiple UFO sightings across Europe and North America, the beginning of what researchers called the modern UFO era. Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting of flying saucers over Mount Rainier in June 47, the Maury Island incident, the Mantell crash, strange lights over Sweden and Norway that military officials couldn't explain. The world was seeing things in the sky that didn't fit conventional understanding, and apparently the Vatican was finding things on the ground. Lucian found another thread: archaeological expeditions. In February 1948, a French-Egyptian archaeological team had been excavating near St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai in Egypt. The monastery itself dated back to the 6th century, built on the site where Moses was said to have encountered the burning bush. It was one of the oldest continuously operating Christian monasteries in the world. The expedition, led by the Louvre Museum in partnership with the Egyptian Department of Antiquities, had been exploring Roman-era structures in the vicinity. A brief article in Le Monde from March 5th, 1948, mentioned that the team had discovered previously unknown chambers beneath ancient foundations, and had found artifacts of unusual origin requiring further study. Then nothing. The expedition was abruptly shut down in late March. No final report was ever published. The artifacts were never catalogued or displayed. Lucian tracked down everything he could find about the expedition leader, François Dubois. An accomplished archaeologist, Dubois had worked on major digs across the Middle East before and after the war, but he never published anything about the Sinai excavation. In fact, he barely worked again after 1948. He found a 1983 obituary from a regional French newspaper. Dubois had spent his final years in a village in Provence, refusing interviews, declining to discuss his career. But a former colleague, quoted in the obituary, mentioned something haunting. François changed after Sinai. He used to love talking about his work, his discoveries. After that expedition, he wouldn't discuss it. The one time I pressed him, years later over wine, he said something I've never forgotten. What we found wasn't meant to be found. The Church understood that better than we did. Some knowledge is a curse, not a gift. He never explained what he meant. The Church understood that better than we did. Lucian stood and paced his small apartment, his mind racing. The pieces were connecting across decades and continents. An archaeological team finds something strange in Egypt. The expedition is shut down. Shortly after, the Vatican receives an object that its best scientists can't explain. The Pope goes into seclusion for 3 weeks. And 75 years later, documents referencing all of it are still sealed. What had they found beneath Mount Sinai? And why was it now sitting in a vault beneath the Vatican? Act 3. The first clues of the underground. Giuseppe Momo had been dead since 1940, but his work lived on in one of the Vatican's most photographed features, the double helix staircase designed in 1932 to connect the Vatican museums to the street level. What most tourists didn't know was that Momo had designed far more than just a staircase. Lucian spent 2 days in Rome's municipal archives, requesting every building permit and blueprint filed for Vatican construction between 1930 and 1950. The Vatican was technically a sovereign city-state, but construction that involved Roman utilities or infrastructure required coordination with Italian authorities. What he found was extraordinary. In 1935, Momo had submitted plans for expanded archive storage facilities beneath the Vatican Library. The blueprints showed 4 subterranean levels extending more than 60 feet below ground. The drawings were technical and detailed. Level 1 was clearly the main archive floor, high ceilings, climate control, standard library storage. Level 2 showed denser shelving, lower ceilings, presumably for less accessed materials. But Level 3's blueprint was different. It showed a series of sealed vault rooms, each with reinforced walls marked as pressurized containment. Notation in Italian indicated specialized environmental controls and restricted access protocols. And then there was Level 4. The blueprint for the lowest level was sparse. Just a single large chamber marked Sala Indicis, Nullus Accessus. The Hall of the Index, no entry. no details about what the chamber contained, no specifications for shelving or storage, just a rectangular space with walls marked in red ink and a single access point from level 3. Lucian photographed every page. He needed to talk to someone who'd actually been inside. Finding a former Swiss guard willing to talk wasn't easy. The Vatican's ceremonial security force took their vows of discretion seriously, even after retirement. But Lucian had made contacts during his years researching church history. Matteo Ricci had served from 1981 to 1991, long enough to see administrations change and secrets accumulate. Now in his mid-60s, he lived in a modest house in Frascati, in the hills outside Rome. They met at a cafe overlooking the town square. Ricci was compact and fit despite his age, his eyes still carrying the watchful quality of someone trained to notice everything. He listened as Lucian explained his research in careful, general terms. "You're asking about the lower archives," Ricci said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "What you need to understand is that the guard's duties include protection of materials, not just people. We rotate through different posts. Some are ceremonial, some are very much not." "Level 4?" Lucian asked. Ricci sipped his espresso. "In 10 years of service, I escorted exactly 3 people to level 4. All of them were astronomers from the observatory. All 3 visits happened during night shifts. Each time they went down alone after we opened the seals. We waited at the level 3 checkpoint. What did they do down there? I don't know. They never spoke about it. But I can tell you this. They all looked different when they came back up. Not frightened, exactly. Shaken. Like they'd seen something that changed how they understood the world. Did you ever see what was down there? No, but I heard something once." Ricci leaned forward. "During one of those night escorts, while we were waiting on level 3, I heard a sound from below. Mechanical. Like a generator running, but with a different pitch. Almost like humming. It came through the ventilation system." "Humming? Not continuous, intermittent, and it didn't sound like any machinery I'd heard before." He paused. "One of the other guards joked that it sounded like something breathing. He was reassigned the next week." Lucian felt his skin prickle. "When was the last time someone accessed level 4? "While I was serving. 1989. A Jesuit astronomer from Castel Gandolfo. After that night, the access protocols changed. Papal authorization required in writing. Do you know what they keep down there?" Ricci looked at him for a long moment. "Officially? No. But Vatican security operates on need to know. What I needed to know was, protect access to level 4, trust no one without proper authorization, and never ask questions." He finished his espresso. "But in 10 years you hear things. Other guards, older staff, whispers in the mess hall. There's something down there that predates most of the collection upstairs. Something they've been keeping sealed since before I was born." "What do the whispers say it is?" "Proof," Ricci said quietly. "Proof of something the Church has been protecting the world from knowing. Act 4. The object that changed everything. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source, a deathbed confession." Lucian found it in an online archive of oral histories collected by a retired American journalist named Robert Hayes. Hayes had spent the 1990s interviewing former intelligence operatives, diplomats, and clergy about Cold War secrets. One interview, conducted in 1997, with a former Vatican archivist named Monsignor Carlo Benedetti, had been labelled sensitive and embargoed until 2025. But someone had leaked it early. The audio quality was poor, but Benedetti's voice was clear enough. "They brought it in through the service entrance at night," the old priest said. "This was July of 48, just after the feast of Saints Peter and Paul. I was a young clerk then, working in the manuscript department. We all knew something unusual was happening because Cardinal Montini himself was there, and he never came down to the archive floors." "What did they bring?" Hayes asked. "A container. Metal. Very heavy. Required 4 men to carry it. About the size of a steamer trunk. It had markings on it I didn't recognise. Symbols that weren't Latin, weren't Greek, weren't anything I'd studied." "Where did it come from?" "Egypt, we were told. Recovered from an expedition near Sinai. But there were rumours it had been found in a chamber that predated the Monastery predated Christianity entirely. Some said the chamber had been sealed since before the Exodus. What was inside the container? A long pause on the recording. I never saw it opened, but I helped catalogue the documentation that came with it. There were photographs, black and white, not very clear. They showed an object that looked like a sphere, maybe 30 centimetres across. The surface appeared metallic, but with a strange texture, almost organic. The photographs showed it under different types of light, and in some of them you could see symbols or writing covering its surface. Writing in what language? Unknown! The philologists couldn't identify it. One of them said it didn't match any known alphabet, ancient or modern. Another said the mathematical properties of the symbol arrangement suggested it wasn't human. The recording hissed with static. The documentation included field notes from the excavation, Benedetti continued. They'd used what was then cutting-edge technology, Geiger counters. The object was emitting radiation, but not any type they could identify. Not alpha, beta, or gamma, something else. What did the Vatican do with it? His Holiness issued a decree personally. The object was designated Custodia Angelica, the angelic custody. Everything related to it was classified at the highest level. The container was taken to a vault I'd never heard of below the regular archives. The documentation was locked away separately. Did you see the decree? Only a copy, briefly, before it too was sealed. But I remember one line very clearly. It said, "Documents and items that challenge the created order are to be sealed at the highest level, known only to the throne of Peter and those he deems necessary for the Church's protection." Challenge the created order, Hayes repeated. What does that mean? I think it means, Benedetti said slowly, that whatever they found, it contradicted the fundamental understanding of how the world was made, of humanity's place in creation, of where we came from. Are you saying it was extraterrestrial? Another long pause. I'm saying the Church believed it was important enough to hide from the world for eternity. The interview ended shortly after. Lucian sat in his apartment, the audio file playing in the background. Custodia Angelica, the angelic custody. He pulled up everything he could find about Pope Pius XII's activities in July 1948. The public record showed normal audiences, a meeting with diplomats from newly formed Israel, routine business. But Lucian found something else, a photograph from the Vatican newspaper, dated July 28, 1948. It showed Pius XII in the Vatican gardens, but the caption noted he was recovering from a brief illness that had kept him from public audiences the previous week. The Pope wasn't sick often. Medical records eventually made public showed he'd been in good health throughout that period. So why the absence? Lucian thought about the logistics. If you're the Pope, and someone brings you an object that challenges the created order, what do? You don't just lock it away. You try to understand it. You consult experts, astronomers, scientists, theologians, and you pray. Maybe a week of illness was actually a week of grappling with the implications of what had been found beneath the desert. Lucian needed to know more about the object itself. If Vatican astronomers had examined it, there might be records at the observatory. He started making plans to visit Castel Gandolfo. Act 5. What lies below Level 4. The Vatican Observatory occupied part of the papal palace at Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer residence in the Alban Hills. In 2014, Pope Francis had opened the palace to visitors, but the observatory itself remained an active research institution. Lucian arranged a visit under the pretense of researching the history of Vatican astronomical work. He was granted a brief tour and time with one of the senior Jesuits, Father Antonio Marchetti, who oversaw the historical archives. Marchetti was in his 70s, his cassock immaculate, his manner warm but cautious. They spoke in the library, surrounded by century-old telescopes and stellar charts. "We're proud of our history," Marchetti said. "The Church has always sought to understand God's creation through reason and observation." "I'm particularly interested in the post-war period," Lucian said. 1947 through 50. There seems to have been significant activity. Ah, yes. Lemaitre was doing revolutionary work then, and Father O'Connell was leading important observations. Were they examining anything unusual during that time, beyond standard celestial observations? Marchetti's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Define unusual. Lucian decided to take a risk. I found references to an object brought to the Vatican in 48, something that required analysis by trained astronomers. The old priest was quiet for a moment, studying Lucian's face. "You're talking about the Sinai artifact," he said finally. Lucian's heart raced. "Yes." Marchetti stood and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens. "I shouldn't discuss this, but I'm old, and perhaps the truth deserves to see daylight eventually." He turned back. "What do you know already?" "That an object was recovered from Egypt, that it showed unusual properties, that Vatican astronomers examined it, and that the findings were sealed." "We shared data with NASA in the 70s, Marchetti said quietly. "A gesture of scientific cooperation. Some of it came from the 48 analysis." "What kind of data?" "Radiation signatures unlike anything in our reference materials. Structural analysis showing molecular arrangements that don't match known periodic table configurations. And something else." He paused. "Inside the sphere, we found a partial star map." "A map?" "Etched into the interior surface, visible only under specific wavelengths of light. It showed stellar positions, but the configuration didn't match any known region of space visible from Earth. Either it was created from a different vantage point in the galaxy, or it's very, very old and the stars have shifted." "How old?" "The metallurgical analysis suggested the object was at least 10,000 years old, possibly much older. The radiation decay rates indicated it had been sealed in that Egyptian chamber for at least 3,000 years. Lucian absorbed this. What did the Vatican conclude? Officially? Nothing. The research was classified and the object was sealed away. But unofficially, Marchetti returned to his chair, we concluded that Earth had been visited by an intelligence not of this world, sometime in deep antiquity, and that they'd left evidence of their presence. Why seal that away? Why not share it? Because of what else we found, Marchetti said. When we decoded portions of the symbols on the sphere's surface, using pattern analysis and comparative linguistic methods, we discovered something disturbing. What? The symbols seemed to reference genetic information, specifically structures that closely resembled the human genome, which we didn't even fully understand until decades later. It was as if the object contained a blueprint, or a recipe. The implications crashed over Lucian like a wave. "You're saying it showed that humans were—" "I'm saying the artifact suggested that human development may have been influenced, possibly engineered, by whoever created that sphere. And if that's true, it contradicts fundamental church teaching about divine creation. So they buried it." "They protected the faith," Marchetti corrected. "Imagine announcing to the world in 1948 that humans might be the product of ancient extraterrestrial intervention. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, during the beginning of the Cold War, when people were desperate for meaning and stability, the world would have come apart. Do you think it's still there? In the vault?" Marchetti looked at him carefully. "I think some truths are meant to remain sealed until humanity is ready for them, and I think we're still not ready." But Lucian was already planning his next move. AC-6. The modern cover-up. Getting back into the Vatican archives without authorization would be impossible through conventional means. But Lucian had spent years studying the administrative structure of the Holy See, and he knew one thing. Bureaucracies, even ancient ones, ran on routine. He started by mapping the patterns. The archives closed to researchers at 6 in the evening. Regular staff departed by 7. Security made rounds every 90 minutes through the night, but there were blind spots, service corridors, maintenance access, the kinds of back channels that existed in any old building. Lucian befriended a maintenance supervisor at a cafe near the Vatican, bought him enough drinks to loosen his tongue, and learned about the utility tunnels connecting various Vatican buildings. Some dated back to medieval times, others were added during Renaissance construction, still others carved out in the 20th century for modern infrastructure. He obtained contractor coveralls and a forged work order, waited until the lunch shift change, and simply walked through a service entrance marked authorised personnel only. Inside, the Vatican was a maze of marble and shadows. Lucian followed the blueprints he'd memorised, descending through maintenance stairwells that weren't shown on any tourist map. The air grew cooler, the stone older. He reached a bronze door beneath the Cortile del Belvedere, exactly where Momo's blueprints indicated level 1 of the underground archives began. Etched into the metal were words in Latin: "Non licet hominis intrare." Man may not enter. The door wasn't locked. Why would it be, this far from normal access? Lucian pushed it open and stepped into history. The corridor beyond was stone, lit by LED strips that seemed obscenely modern against the ancient walls. The temperature was precisely controlled, the air dry and still. He could hear the hum of climate control systems. Level 1 was as the blueprint showed, vast shelving units holding bound volumes, bankers' boxes, archival containers. He moved quickly past them, finding the stairs down. Level 2 was denser, the ceilings lower, the lighting dimmer. Still archives, still documents, but older. He saw dates on boxes: 1700s, 1600s, 1500s. Level 3 was different. The stairs emptied into an antechamber with walls of solid steel. Beyond was a corridor lined with vault doors, each marked with a simple number. No descriptions, no indexes, just numbered vaults. The climate control was more aggressive here. He could feel it drying his sinuses with each breath. Vault 12's door was slightly ajar. Lucian pushed it open and found himself in a long, narrow chamber. Lead-lined boxes on shelves, each labelled in Latin. He scanned the labels quickly. Fragmenta Qumrana, Cave 4, Codex Incognitus, Origin Uncertain. Correspondence regarding celestial anomalies, 1633 to 1642. And then he saw it. A glass cylinder on a separate pedestal, about the size of a wine bottle. Inside floated a metallic sphere, suspended in some kind of clear fluid. The sphere was maybe a foot in diameter, its surface covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the LED light. The label beneath read, "Object retrieved near Sinai, July 1948, Custodia Angelica, Papal Decree 347. Lucian approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe. The sphere seemed to glow faintly from within, pulsing with a rhythm like a heartbeat. Up close, he could see the symbols covering its surface. They weren't engraved. They seemed to be part of the material itself, flowing across the metal like liquid script. Nothing like any alphabet he'd ever seen. He took out his phone, hands shaking, and photographed the sphere from every angle. Then he noticed the leather-bound volume on the shelf beside the cylinder. The cover was blank except for 2 words in gold leaf. Chronicon Externum, Chronicle of the Outsiders. Lucian opened it carefully. The pages were vellum, the ink medieval, but the text had been written in modern Italian, a translation of something older. He read the first passage. In the 4th year of Constantine's reign, lights appeared over Rome for 3 nights. They moved with purpose against the stars. The Bishop of Rome declared them signs of divine favour, but in private correspondence he wrote, "They are the same lights our forefathers saw, the same visitors who came before Christ, before Moses, before the flood. We do not speak of them openly, for the people are not ready to understand that we are not alone in God's creation." Lucian flipped through pages, his mind reeling. Passage after passage described encounters between church figures and beings descending from the sky. References to lights over Byzantium in the 9th century. Strange visitors to monasteries in the Andes in the 1500s. Objects recovered from ancient sites and quietly brought to Rome. And then he found an entry dated 1793. The sphere brought from Egypt contains knowledge forbidden to man. Its makers understood the architecture of life itself. They knew what we are, how we were formed, perhaps even shaped our development. This knowledge must remain sealed, for if the faithful learned that their origins were guided by intelligence not divine, the foundation of Christendom would crumble. Lucian heard footsteps. He closed the volume, grabbed his phone and moved toward the back of the vault. There, another door, barely visible in the shadows. It led down. Level 4. The stairs were narrow, carved from bedrock rather than constructed. Each step showed chisel marks, as if this passage had been hewn by hand centuries ago. The walls were no longer finished stone but raw rock, damp with condensation, as if this level had been excavated from the earth itself rather than built into it. The air changed as he descended. Colder, heavier, charged with something he couldn't name, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, thick with potential energy. His phone's flashlight beam bounced off the moisture on the rough walls. The stairs spiraled down, deeper than the blueprints had suggested. 19 meters, Momo's plans had said, 62 feet. But it felt deeper, as if he were descending not just through rock, but through time itself, peeling back layers of history to reach something primordial. At the bottom was a single chamber, just as the blueprint showed. The Sala Indicis. Lucian stepped off the final stair and stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The room was circular, maybe 40 feet across, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadow above. The walls were ancient stone, not Roman, older, predating even the Empire. But embedded in those ancient walls was technology that seemed pulled from a science fiction film. Computer servers lined the perimeter, their LED indicators blinking in the darkness like a constellation. Fibre optic cables snaked across the stone floor. Climate control units hummed softly, maintaining precise temperature and humidity. Electrical conduits ran along the ceiling, feeding power to equipment that had no business existing in a medieval vault. But all of that was peripheral. His eyes went immediately to the centre of the room. A large glass case, maybe 10 feet tall and 6 feet wide, stood on a raised platform of polished black stone. Inside, suspended in electromagnetic fields that crackled faintly with blue-white energy, was a sphere. Not like the smaller one upstairs. This was massive, perhaps 6 feet in diameter, large enough that a person could stand inside it. The surface gleamed with a metallic sheen that shifted colours as Lucian moved. Bronze to silver to copper to colours he didn't have names for. The sphere wasn't still. It rotated slowly, majestically, in the electromagnetic field, and as it turned, the symbols covering its surface became visible. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, flowing across the metal like water, rearranging themselves in patterns that made Lucian's eyes hurt to follow. The light from the sphere cast strange shadows on the walls, not the hard-edged shadows of ordinary objects, but soft, diffuse glows that seemed to have depth and dimension of their own. Lucian approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the chamber. As he got closer, he realized the sphere was humming, not the mechanical hum of the servers, but something organic, alive. The sound Ricci had described, like breathing, like something that had a heartbeat. The temperature near the sphere was different, warmer. The air shimmered slightly as if reality itself bent around the object, and on the wall behind it, projected from somewhere inside the sphere itself, were images. A star map. But not any stars Lucian recognized from Earth's night sky. The constellations were wrong, the patterns unfamiliar. Either this map showed the cosmos from a different vantage point, somewhere else in the galaxy perhaps, or it depicted the sky as it had appeared thousands of years ago, before the slow dance of stellar drift had changed the heavens. Beside the star map was another diagram, and Lucian's scientific training allowed him to recognize it immediately. A double helix, DNA, but not quite human DNA. The structure was similar, the same basic architecture of nucleotides and base pairs, but there were additional elements, extra strands, sequences that shouldn't exist in terrestrial genetics. It looked like a blueprint, or a recipe, instructions for creating something. And at the bottom of the projection, in symbols that somehow translated themselves in his mind, Not in words, but in pure meaning, in concepts that bypassed language entirely, was a message. They came before Adam, before the first human, before the garden, before the story that billions of people believed explained where humanity began. Lucian stood transfixed, his mind struggling to process the implications. This wasn't evidence of ancient visitors. This was evidence of intervention, of design, of humanity being created, or at least guided, modified, engineered, by something that came from the stars. His hand reached out almost of its own volition toward the glass case. The surface was cold, vibrating faintly from the electromagnetic fields within. "Mr. Ferraro," the voice echoed through the chamber, cold and precise. Lucian spun around. One was elderly, with silver hair and cold eyes. The other was younger, carrying a tablet computer. "Mr. Ferraro," the older man said in accented English, "you've come quite far." Lucian recognised him from photographs. Monsignor Alfredo Rizzi, from the Secretariat of State. "What is this?" Lucian asked. "Protection," Rizzi said simply. "Archives are sealed for the safety of the faithful. Some truths cause more destruction than ignorance. You're hiding evidence that humanity was visited by extraterrestrial intelligence." "We're preserving social order," Rizzi corrected. "Look at this object. Truly look at it. What do you see?" Lucian looked back at the sphere. The symbols were rearranging faster now, as if responding to his presence. "I see proof," he said. "You see questions without answers," Rizzi replied. "Who made this? Why did they come? What did they do to us? And most importantly, where are they now? We've had these objects for centuries, Mr. Ferraro. We've studied them with the best scientific minds the Church could provide, and we still don't know. Then tell the world. Let everyone study them. And watch civilization tear itself apart." Rizzi shook his head. "The artifact suggests human origins may have been engineered, that we were designed, or at minimum influenced by non-human intelligence. How do you think that knowledge would affect the 6 billion people who believe they were created in the image of God, or the billions more who have different but equally fundamental origin stories? People have a right to the truth. People have a right to stability," Rizzi countered, "to meaning, to hope. This," he gestured at the sphere, "offers only chaos, questions that undermine every foundation we've built civilization upon. So you'll keep it buried forever, until humanity is ready, if that day ever comes." Rizzi nodded to his companion, who tapped something on the tablet. The lights in the chamber brightened. Lucian could see security cameras in every corner. "You've been recorded since you entered Level 3, Rizzi said. "We could charge you with breaking and entering a sovereign nation, but instead, I'm going to offer you a choice. Leave now, forget what you've seen, and continue your life. Your research privileges will be restored, your reputation intact. And if I refuse, then you'll disappear into the Vatican's justice system, and no one will find you until we decide to release you. The Holy See has its own laws, its own courts. You have no rights here except those we grant you." Lucian looked back at the sphere one last time. The star map was still visible on the wall behind it. He thought about everything he'd learned. The object from Sinai, the chronicle of the outsiders, the implications that shook the foundations of human history. And he realized Rizzi was right about one thing. He didn't have answers, only more questions. "I'll leave," Lucian said quietly. "But this won't stay buried forever." "Perhaps not," Rizzi agreed, "but not today. Not by you." They escorted him up through the levels, through the corridors, and out into the Roman afternoon. Tourists were streaming towards St. Peter's Basilica, taking selfies, buying souvenirs, completely unaware of what lay beneath their feet. Acet 7. The final revelation. Lucian tried to publish his findings. He contacted journalists at major newspapers, the New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, Corriere della Sera. He reached out to academics he'd known for years, people he'd published with, collaborated with, trusted. He shared his photographs, his recordings from the deathbed confession, his documentation of the blueprints and the historical trail leading to Level 4. No one would touch it. At first, they seemed interested. A journalist from the Washington Post spent 2 hours on the phone with him, asking detailed questions, requesting follow-up evidence, then radio silence. When Lucian finally reached him again, the journalist said simply, "The story doesn't check out. Our Vatican sources say the documents you're referencing are forgeries. I'm sorry." An editor at The Guardian was more direct. "Look, Lucian, I believe you believe this, but we'd need more than photographs and second-hand accounts. We'd need the actual artifacts, independent verification, multiple sources, and frankly, even if it's all true, I'm not sure publishing it would serve the public interest. This would cause global chaos." A history professor at Oxford, someone Lucian had known since graduate school, was blunter still. "You need help, mate. Professional help. This conspiracy theory thinking, it's not healthy. Take a break. See someone. Get your head sorted." The Vatican's influence was subtle but comprehensive. Publications that showed initial interest suddenly lost interest. Editors who wanted the story were transferred or replaced. One journalist who pushed too hard, a freelancer in Rome who'd started asking questions at the Vatican press office, found her credentials revoked for ethical violations that were never specified. Her work visa was questioned. She left Italy 2 weeks later. Lucian realised the pattern. They weren't killing the story through force. They were killing it through erosion, through institutional pressure, through the application of influence accumulated over 2,000 years of existence. How do you fight an institution that's outlasted empires? 2 weeks after his expulsion from the archives, on a Wednesday evening as Rome settled into its golden hour light, Lucian returned to his apartment to find an envelope on his doormat. No postage, no courier stamp. Just a crisp white envelope that had been hand-delivered by someone who could access his building without being buzzed in. Inside was a single note, handwritten in elegant cursive script. "Truth is a burden, Mr. Ferraro. Some carry it for a lifetime, others are crushed beneath its weight. Leave it where it belongs, in the dark, where it can harm no one." Beneath the note was a photograph. It showed him standing in level 4, illuminated by the blue-white glow of the sphere, looking up at the star map on the wall. The image was crisp, high resolution, taken by one of the security cameras Rizzi had shown him. The message was clear. "We were watching. We are always watching. We have evidence of your trespass. We can use it whenever we choose." But at the bottom of the envelope, tucked beneath the photograph, Lucian found something else. Something they hadn't meant to send. Or perhaps something they had meant to send, though he couldn't fathom why. A small shard of metal, no larger than his thumbnail. Irregular in shape, as if it had been broken off a larger piece. It had the same strange texture as the sphere, smooth but somehow organic, with that peculiar sheen that shifted colours as it caught the light. The same flowing symbols covered its surface, impossibly small, visible only when he held it up to his desk lamp and squinted. Lucian turned it over in his fingers, his heart racing. Was this a threat? A warning? Or something else? A test, perhaps? Or an admission that the truth couldn't be contained forever? That it leaked out in fragments and whispers despite their best efforts? He set it on his desk and watched it in the dimming evening light. And then it began to glow. Faint at first, just a hint of luminescence from deep within the metal itself. But as the apartment darkened and night settled over Rome, the glow intensified, a soft blue-white pulse that matched the rhythm he'd seen in the sphere. Like a heartbeat, like something alive. Lucian picked it up again. The metal was warm now, generating its own heat. The symbols seemed to move, flowing across its surface like liquid mercury, rearranging themselves into new configurations. He held it close, studying the patterns, and as he watched, something impossible happened. The symbols began to make sense. Not in words. He couldn't have translated them into Italian or English or any human language. But in concepts, in pure meaning that bypassed language entirely, the patterns conveyed information directly into his mind. Coordinates. Not on Earth, but in space. A location among the stars, 42 light-years distant in the direction of the constellation Cancer, a time period 200,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia, and something else, a purpose, a reason. They had come because Earth was one of thousands, because intelligence was rare but not unique, because they had seeded life across this arm of the galaxy, modifying, guiding, watching, not gods, not demons, just gardeners, cultivating intelligence wherever they found promising raw material. And they were still watching. Lucian set the shard down, his hands shaking. The glow faded as soon as he released it, dimming back to inert metal. He sat in the darkness of his apartment for a long time, the shard on his desk pulsing softly, rhythmically, like a beacon or a message or a promise. Outside his window, Rome glowed in the night. Millions of people living their lives in the eternal city, walking streets that had been walked for 3,000 years, praying in churches built on pagan temples, believing they understood where they came from, why they were here, what their place in the cosmos meant. And beneath the Vatican, in chambers sealed from the world, an object pulsed with light that had travelled across stars, carrying a truth that had been hidden for millennia. Lucian thought about Rizzi's words, about his grandmother's faith, about the journalist who'd fled Italy, about the fabric of civilization built on beliefs that might be beautiful lies. Was truth always good? Was knowledge always liberating? Or were some truths too dangerous to speak aloud? He didn't know, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The world's origin story was far stranger than anyone imagined. We weren't alone in the universe. We never had been. And somewhere, 42 light-years away, or perhaps much closer, they were still out there. The gardeners who'd shaped us, the visitors who'd come before Adam, the intelligence that had guided human evolution and then stepped back, watching to see what we'd become. Lucian picked up the shard again. In the dim light of his apartment, the symbols rearranged themselves one more time, forming a pattern he recognised instinctively, even though he'd never seen it before. A question. Are you ready? He didn't know how to answer. How could anyone answer that? Was humanity ready to learn its true origins? Ready to understand that we were designed, cultivated, engineered for purposes we could barely comprehend? The shard pulsed once more in his hand, warm and alive and waiting. Not yet, Lucian thought, but soon. The truth was waiting. It had waited 10,000 years, buried beneath temples and sealed in vaults, hidden in chromosomes and encoded in artifacts scattered across the world. It could wait a little longer, but not forever, because fragments had a way of accumulating. Whispers had a way of growing louder, and secrets, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of finding the light. Lucian placed the shard in his desk drawer, in a small wooden box that had belonged to his grandmother. The irony wasn't lost on him. Hiding evidence that would destroy her faith inside a keepsake from her life of devotion. He turned off his desk lamp and sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Rome at night, scooters buzzing past, voices drifting up from the street, somewhere, church bells tolling the hour. And beneath all of it, if he listened very carefully, he could still hear the faint hum of that shard in its wooden box, pulsing with its ancient rhythm, like breathing, like something waiting to wake up, like a truth that refused to stay buried. Lucian closed his eyes and thought about the future, about a day when that drawer would be opened, when that shard would be studied by scientists not bound by Vatican secrecy, when its message would be decoded and shared and understood by all of humanity. That day would come, maybe not in his lifetime, maybe not in his daughter's lifetime, but someday. Because truth, he'd learned, was patient, and the visitors who'd come before Adam, they were patient too, watching from 42 light-years away, or perhaps much closer, waiting to see if their garden would finally bloom into something worth revealing themselves to, waiting to see if humanity was ready to learn that we weren't created in God's image, we were created in theirs.